What if the oldest empire in human history wasn't lost because it's still buried beneath every ancient city we've ever excavated? This isn't speculation. It's a pattern documented across 4 continents, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, from Anatolia to the Americas. Archaeological teams have uncovered the same unsettling reality. Beneath the oldest known civilizations lie foundations of something older, something planned, something that shouldn't exist according to every model of human development. We're talking about precision stonework beneath Sumerian temples, massive architectural foundations under settlements dated to 8000 BC, entire drowned cities off coastlines that were above water only during the last ice age. These aren't isolated mysteries. They form a pattern that systematically dismantles the timeline you learned in school, the one that places the birth of civilization safely at 6,000 years ago. The evidence isn't hidden. It's been accumulating in excavation reports, geological surveys, and underwater archaeology for decades. But what it suggests is so radical that most historians have chosen to treat each discovery as an anomaly rather than recognize the pattern they create together. These findings don't just push back the date of civilization. They suggest that what we call the beginning of history might actually be a restart, a rebuilding after something was buried, flooded, and forgotten. If you enjoy exploring the edges of accepted history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add atmosphere, but they aren't a necessity to follow the story. Prepare yourselves. Let's dive beneath the surface. Let's begin. In 1922, in the sun-scorched ruins of southern Mesopotamia, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Ur when his team encountered something that would quietly haunt archaeology for the next century. Beneath the royal tombs, beneath the temples, beneath everything they expected to be the city's foundation, they found another layer, an older occupation level, separated from the upper city by several meters of clean, water-deposited clay, a flood layer. When Woolley first broke through into this lower stratum, he expected to find virgin soil, the beginning. Instead, he found pottery, tools, and building foundations. Civilization didn't start at the surface. It had been buried and built over. The excavation logs from that season document the moment with characteristic British understatement. At a depth of 7 meters below the royal cemetery, the soil changed abruptly. The rich, artifact-laden earth gave way to uniform clay, pure sediment. No pottery shards, no tool fragments, no ash deposits, no organic material, just clay, the kind that settles slowly from floodwater over months or years. Woolley's team dug through it, assuming they'd reached bedrock. 1 meter down through the clay, 2 meters, 3 meters. At 3.5 meters of pure flood deposit, they broke through to something else. Another occupation layer, another city. But here's where the timeline fractures. The style of these artifacts was different, older, more refined in some ways than what came after. This wasn't the work of primitive people slowly inventing culture. This was organized society, just deeper. The pottery recovered from beneath the flood layer showed sophisticated firing techniques. The building foundations demonstrated urban planning, aligned streets, standardized measurements. Someone had mapped this city, before construction began. Someone had coordinated labor on a massive scale. Someone had maintained quality control over ceramic production. All of this existed below the flood line, below what should have been the beginning. Woolley called it the flood stratum, and initially believed he'd found evidence of the biblical deluge. The academic world dismissed this interpretation quickly, preferring to see it as a local river flooding, perhaps a particularly severe Euphrates overflow that had inundated the settlement temporarily before residents returned and rebuilt. The narrative was comforting, localized, explicable. It preserved the timeline. But Woolley had uncovered something more disturbing than proof of an old story. He'd found evidence of a pattern. Because Ur wasn't unique. The critical detail that most subsequent discussions of Ur omit is this: the pottery beneath the flood layer was more advanced than the pottery above it. Read that again. The deeper, older settlement produced ceramics with finer clay composition, more consistent firing temperatures, and more sophisticated decorative techniques than the settlement that rebuilt on top of it after the flood. This is the opposite of what technological development looks like. Progress doesn't move backward. Skills don't regress, unless the people who rebuilt the upper city weren't the same people who built the lower city, unless the knowledge was lost in the interval, unless the survivors of whatever buried the lower city had to relearn ceramic production from fragmented memory, which forces a question the field has spent a century avoiding. What if the lower city of Ur wasn't primitive? What if it was ancestral? And Ur wasn't alone. In the 1930s, excavations at Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, revealed the same structure. The site lies 40 kilometers south of Ur, closer to what would have been the Persian Gulf coastline in antiquity. Sumerian mythology identifies Eridu as the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven. When archaeologists began systematic excavation in 1946, under Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, they discovered that Sumerian tradition might have been more accurate than anyone anticipated. Eridu wasn't one city. It was 18 cities, stacked vertically like a layer cake of history. Each level represented a distinct occupation period, complete with temples, residential areas, and infrastructure, each layer older and stranger than the one above. The excavation proceeded downward through time, peeling back millennia with each meter of descent. Level 1, the surface, showed recognizable Sumerian architecture from around 3000 BC. Level 6, about halfway down, revealed transitional forms. Buildings that looked Sumerian but used construction techniques that predated standard Sumerian methods. Level 12 showed architectural sophistication that shouldn't exist at 7000 BC. Large-scale temple platforms, urban planning, coordinated construction, and then they reached level 18, the deepest level, the foundation. What they found there violated every model of human development. Monumental temple platforms, carefully oriented to cardinal directions. Massive mud brick structures requiring thousands of workers and centralized authority to construct. A city grid laid out with geometric precision. Evidence of specialized labor, social hierarchy, surplus agricultural production, long-distance trade networks, all dated through ceramic analysis and stratigraphic context to approximately 7000 BC. This was before writing, before the wheel, before bronze metallurgy, before everything we associate with civilization. Yet someone at Eridu had organized labor on a scale that required social complexity, economic surplus, and institutional authority. Someone had planned a city before building it. Someone had maintained architectural standards across multiple construction phases. The temple at level 18 wasn't crude or experimental. It was monumental and intentional. The academic explanation for Eridu has always been gradual development. The idea is that level 18 represents an early stage, and each subsequent level shows incremental technological and social advancement until we arrive at recognizable Sumerian civilization at the surface, progress through time. This narrative is reassuring. It fits the model. It preserves the timeline that civilization begins with agriculture, develops through settled villages, and eventually produces cities around 4000 BC. But here's the problem that archaeologists working at Eridu documented but couldn't explain. The deepest levels show more planning, not less. The lower you go at Eridu, the more organized the city becomes. Level 18 has clearer urban layout than Level 12. Level 12 has more sophisticated architectural features than Level 6. It's not a gradual climb toward complexity. It's a descent from complexity. As if whoever built the foundation of Eridu knew exactly what they were doing, and their knowledge was slowly lost over thousands of years of subsequent occupation. As if the city at the bottom wasn't the beginning of an experiment. It was the continuation of something already understood. Which means Eridu's foundation wasn't built by farmers learning to organize. It was built by people who already knew how. But beneath Mesopotamia is just the beginning of the pattern. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellert began excavating a massive mound in central Turkey that would become one of the most significant archaeological sites of the 20th century. Çatalhöyük. The name means fork mound in Turkish, an unassuming designation for what would prove to be one of the world's oldest cities. Carbon dating would eventually place the main occupation between 7,500 and 5,700 BC. The site spans 34 acres. At its peak, approximately 10,000 people lived there. For context, that's larger than most medieval European cities. In 7000 BC. But the truly unsettling aspect of Çatalhöyük isn't its size. It's the complete absence of developmental stages. The city appears in the archaeological record fully formed. There are no proto-villages nearby, no evidence of gradual settlement expansion, no trial and error architecture, no learning curve. Çatalhöyük just exists, suddenly, with sophisticated urban planning, complex social hierarchy, advanced agricultural systems, artistic traditions, and standardized architectural techniques. The houses are uniform, rectangular mud brick structures, each approximately 25 square meters, built wall to wall with no streets between them. Access was through the roof. Ladders descended into each dwelling from above. The entire city was a continuous architectural surface, like a massive honeycomb, with people moving across rooftops between homes. This design requires citywide coordination. You can't build houses this way through independent family decisions. Someone planned the layout. Someone enforced building codes. Someone coordinated construction across the entire settlement. Inside the houses, the sophistication continues. Plastered walls, decorated with elaborate murals and painted geometric patterns. built-in furniture, sleeping platforms, storage areas. Hearths positioned identically in each structure for optimal ventilation, burial chambers beneath the floors, containing multiple generations of family remains, with grave goods that indicate social stratification. Some burials include obsidian mirrors, copper beads, and ceremonial objects. Others contain only bodies. The inhabitants practiced advanced agriculture. They cultivated 14 different plant species, including emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and bitter vetch. They herded sheep and goats. They hunted wild cattle, deer, and boar. They produced textiles from wool and plant fibers. They manufactured sophisticated pottery with consistent firing temperatures and decorative styles that remained stable for over 1,000 years. They also practiced dentistry. Human remains show evidence of tooth extraction and dental manipulation. They created art. Hundreds of figurines, mostly depicting female forms, suggest religious or cultural practices. They traded across hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian at Çatalhöyük was sourced from volcanic regions in central Anatolia, requiring trade networks spanning over 200 kilometers. All of this exists at 7,500 BC, fully operational, with no visible prehistory. The standard archaeological explanation is rapid development or missing evidence. The theory goes that there must have been smaller settlements nearby where people learned these techniques, but we simply haven't found them yet. Or perhaps the development happened so quickly that it left minimal archaeological signature. Or maybe the environmental conditions in the region were uniquely favorable, allowing rapid social complexity. But cities don't spontaneously generate. Urban life requires generations of accumulated knowledge. You need to solve food surplus storage. You need to develop property concepts and inheritance systems. You need to create conflict resolution mechanisms. You need to establish trade protocols. You need to invent standardized weights and measures. You need to develop construction techniques through trial and error. You need to experiment with different social hierarchies until you find stable configurations. All of this takes time, generations, centuries. Yet Çatalhöyük displays none of this experimentation. No failed architectural designs. No transitional social structures. No evidence of learning from mistakes. The site suggests inheritance, not invention. As if the founders of Çatalhöyük didn't invent urban life. They imported it. They arrived at this location already knowing how to organize cities, plan construction, maintain social hierarchy, and coordinate complex agricultural systems. They built Çatalhöyük the same way a modern city planner designs a new development, with pre-existing knowledge. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Where did they learn it? Çatalhöyük's founders didn't invent urban life. They imported it. And the pattern crosses into the Indus Valley. In 1974, French archaeologist Jean-François Jarige began excavating a site in the Balochistan region of modern Pakistan, Mehrgarh. What he discovered would push the boundaries of known agricultural history by thousands of years and raise questions that remain unanswered today. Mehrgarh dates to 7,000 BC. Like Çatalhöyük, it appears suddenly in the archaeological record with sophisticated systems already operational. But the contradictions at Mehrgarh are even more pronounced because they involve not just social organization, but biological impossibilities. The site shows fully domesticated wheat and barley, not wild varieties, not transitional forms, domesticated crops with the genetic markers of centuries of selective breeding. Domestication is a slow process. You need to identify desirable traits, save seeds from the best plants, replant them, observe results, repeat for dozens of generations. Modern genetic analysis suggests wheat domestication requires a minimum of 1,000 years of consistent selection pressure. Yet at Mehrgar, domesticated wheat appears in the earliest layers with no evidence of the wild ancestors in the region. The crops were brought in, already finished. The inhabitants also cultivated domesticated dates, which adds another biological puzzle. Date palms require specific climate conditions and have wild ancestor populations in the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamia, not Pakistan. Someone transported these plants across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. Someone maintained trade networks or migration routes that connected the Indus Valley to the Fertile Crescent in 7000 BC. But the most disturbing discovery at Mehrgar came from the human remains. In 2001, researchers examining skulls from the earliest occupation layers found evidence of dental work. 11 skulls showed precisely drilled holes in molars, clearly intentional, executed with remarkable precision. The holes are too clean and too consistent to be accidental or the result of natural decay. They're dental interventions. Further analysis revealed the technique. The dentists at Mehrgar used bow drills, the same technology used to start fires and drill holes in wood and stone. They applied this technology to teeth, drilling into molars to remove infected or damaged tissue. The procedure would have required steady hands, understanding of tooth anatomy, some method of pain management, and, most critically, demand for the service. People don't develop dentistry in isolation. Dental intervention only emerges in societies with enough surplus and specialization that individuals can dedicate time to medical practice rather than food production. It requires an economic structure where people can afford to pay specialists for non-emergency procedures. It requires accumulated knowledge about which dental problems are treatable and which aren't. All of this exists at Mehrgar, at 7000 BC, which is 4,000 years before conventional timelines place the development of specialized medicine. The settlement also shows storage systems for grain surplus, standardized mud brick architecture, long-distance trade networks extending to the Arabian Sea for shell ornaments, and evidence of social hierarchy in burial practices, all appearing simultaneously in the earliest layers. The academic response has been to classify Mehrgar as an example of independent innovation or rapid adaptation. The theory suggests that favorable environmental conditions in the region allowed unusually quick development of complex society, or that knowledge diffused from Mesopotamia somehow, though the distance and terrain make regular contact unlikely. But here's what the record actually shows. Agricultural systems that require centuries of development appearing without developmental evidence. Medical specialization that requires social complexity appearing at the foundation level. Trade networks that require institutional stability appearing in the earliest occupation. All of this suggests that the founders of Mehrgar arrived with knowledge, not that they invented it on site. Mehrgar's agriculture didn't evolve there. It arrived. 4 sites now, 4 continents, same pattern. Sophisticated, organized civilization appearing at the base of the archaeological record, with no visible learning curve. Woolley's lower city at Ur, buried beneath flood deposits. Eridu's foundation showing more planning than its upper levels. Çatalhöyük's sudden emergence as a fully operational city. Mehrgar's imported agriculture and specialized medicine. Orthodox archaeology treats each site as a separate puzzle. Ur is explained as flood recovery. Eridu is gradual development. Çatalhöyük is rapid innovation. Mehrgar is independent invention. Each site gets its own isolated explanation that preserves the overall timeline. But what if they're not separate puzzles? What if they're data points in the same pattern? By 7000 BC, across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and South Asia, we see the same archaeological fingerprint, sophisticated, organized, systematic civilization appearing beneath or at the base of known history, with no visible development curve. The mainstream timeline places humanity's first civilizations at 3500 BC in Mesopotamia. These sites are older by 3,000 years, and they don't look like firsts. They look like continuations, like rebuilds, like restarts, which raises a question that archaeology has spent a century avoiding. What if these sites aren't the beginning? What if they're the restart? What if something came before? Something that taught them urban planning, agricultural systems, architectural standards, medical specialization, and trade network coordination. Something that was then buried, flooded, destroyed, leaving only survivors who carried the knowledge inland and rebuilt what they remembered. The standard model of civilization says humans invented everything from scratch, starting around 6000 BC. Mesopotamia develops writing. Egypt builds pyramids. China creates bronze. Each region independently working through the same developmental stages, arriving at similar solutions through parallel innovation. But the buried cities tell a different story. They suggest that knowledge existed before the known beginning, that the foundations beneath Sumerian temples weren't primitive experiments. They were earlier implementations of already understood principles. That what we call the birth of civilization might actually be its second act. The evidence is in the ground, beneath every ancient city that's been excavated deeply enough. Beneath 7 meters of flood deposit separating two cities. Beneath Eridu, 18 occupation layers descending into impossibly early sophistication. Beneath our entire timeline, a pattern of prior knowledge that won't stay buried. But if buried cities suggest lost knowledge, what we find in stone suggests lost capability, because the megaliths don't just predate our timeline, they exceed our technology, and that pattern takes us to Turkey, to a hilltop where nothing should exist, to a temple complex that rewrites everything we thought we knew about human capability. The buried cities present a timeline problem, but stone presents something worse, a capability problem. If cities beneath flood layers suggest knowledge that predates known civilization, then megalithic architecture confirms that knowledge included engineering principles we still struggle to explain. We're no longer talking about organizational sophistication or agricultural techniques. We're talking about physical capabilities that shouldn't exist according to available technology. Moving 100-ton stones without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. Cutting granite to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, without diamond saws or modern abrasives. Fitting massive blocks together so precisely that knife blades can't penetrate the joints. Creating structures that have survived earthquakes, weathering, and millennia of abandonment while modern buildings crumble after decades. The stones don't negotiate with our timeline. They don't care what technology ancient people were supposed to have. They simply exist. Impossibly massive, impossibly precise, impossibly old. And the pattern that began with buried cities continues with impossible stones. Because the largest, most precise, most technically sophisticated megalithic structures consistently date to the earliest periods. The oldest are the most advanced, as if capability declined over time rather than improved. Which brings us to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where the timeline doesn't just fracture, it shatters completely. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site that local farmers had known about for generations, Göbekli Tepe. The name means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, another unremarkable designation for what would become the most important archaeological discovery of the late 20th century. What Schmidt found there would force a complete reevaluation of human capability in the pre-agricultural period. Göbekli Tepe isn't a settlement. It's a temple complex. Massive circular enclosures, each containing enormous T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in precise geometric patterns. The pillars are monumental. The largest exceed 5 meters in height and weigh approximately 16 tons. They're not rough-hewn. They're carved with elaborate reliefs depicting animals, abstract symbols, and anthropomorphic figures. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and geometric patterns cover the surfaces in sophisticated artistic compositions. The site contains multiple enclosures, built in phases, then deliberately buried and built over. At least 20 circular structures have been identified through ground-penetrating radar, though only a fraction have been excavated. Each structure required quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting dozens of multi-ton stones. The radiocarbon dates are what make Göbekli Tepe impossible. The oldest structures date to 9,600 BC. Some estimates push back to 10,000 BC or earlier based on stratigraphic context. Read that date again. 9,600 BC? This is pre-pottery Neolithic A, pre-agriculture, pre-permanent settlements, pre-writing, pre-wheel, pre-metallurgy, according to every developmental model of human civilization. The people who built Göbekli Tepe shouldn't have been capable of building anything more sophisticated than temporary shelters and basic stone tools. Yet they quarried 16-ton limestone pillars from bedrock. They carved intricate, three-dimensional reliefs into the stone surface. They transported these pillars hundreds of meters from quarry to construction site. They erected them vertically, sinking them deep into prepared bedrock sockets. They arranged them in geometrically precise circles. They maintained consistent architectural standards across multiple construction phases spanning centuries. And they did all of this before they had agriculture. The academic explanation for Göbekli Tepe has evolved over the past 3 decades as the site's implications became undeniable. The initial response was shock. Schmidt himself stated that the discovery changes everything about understanding the Neolithic period. The current consensus explanation runs something like this. Hunter-gatherers in the region were more socially complex than previously understood. Abundant wild food resources allowed population concentration without agriculture. Religious motivation drove massive communal labor projects. Göbekli Tepe was a ritual center where dispersed groups gathered seasonally to participate in construction and ceremony. The site catalyzed social complexity, and that complexity eventually led to agriculture as a way to support permanent settlement near the ritual center. This narrative is creative. It preserves the developmental model by suggesting that complexity emerged from ritual rather than economics. It's also insufficient. Because here's the problem that no amount of hunter-gatherer sophistication solves. Moving 16-ton stones requires logistics. Specific, calculable logistics. You need force. ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. A 16-ton stone has a mass of roughly 16,000 kilograms. To move it horizontally, you need to overcome static friction and gravitational resistance. Even on rollers, even on the smoothest possible surface, you need sustained pulling force from hundreds of workers coordinated over hours or days. That requires organization, command structure, rest and rotation schedules, food and water provision for the workforce. You need tools, ropes or leather straps capable of withstanding tons of tension without snapping, wooden rollers or sledges, levers for adjustment, stone or bone tools for quarrying and shaping. You need planning. Someone surveyed the quarry. Someone calculated which stones could be successfully extracted. Someone designed the layout of the circles. Someone determined the precise depth and diameter of the bedrock sockets. Someone coordinated the labor of potentially thousands of people across multiple construction seasons. All of this requires surplus. You can't mobilize hundreds or thousands of people for non-food producing labor unless you have excess food production. Hunter-gatherers, by definition, operate close to subsistence. Every day is dedicated to acquiring food. There's no surplus for multi-year temple construction projects. Unless the people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't hunter-gatherers in the way we understand the term. Unless they had food surplus through some method that doesn't leave archaeological signatures we recognize. Unless they inherited organizational knowledge from an earlier period that taught them how to coordinate large labor forces. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe add another layer of impossibility. The reliefs aren't crude or experimental. They show sophisticated artistic tradition, consistent iconography, symbolic systems that remain stable across multiple construction phases. The animals depicted aren't random. They appear in specific combinations and arrangements. Certain symbols repeat across different enclosures. The compositions show planning and meaning. This indicates shared cultural knowledge. Standardized symbolism, religious or mythological frameworks that multiple communities recognized and understood. You don't develop this overnight. Symbolic systems require generations to establish, transmit, and maintain. Yet at Göbekli Tepe, this system appears fully formed in the earliest layers. The site also shows astronomical knowledge. The positions and orientations of the pillars and enclosures appear to encode celestial alignments. Some researchers have identified correlations between the arrangement of stones and constellation positions as they appeared in the 10th millennium BC. One pillar in particular, Pillar 43 in enclosure D, nicknamed the Vulture Stone, has been analyzed by archaeoastronomers who suggest the carved symbols represent a catastrophic comet impact or airburst around 10,950 BC. Whether this specific interpretation is correct remains debated. But the larger point stands. The builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed astronomical knowledge. They observed the sky systematically enough to identify and memorialize celestial events or patterns. This requires decades or centuries of observation, record-keeping through oral tradition or symbolic notation, and transmission of knowledge across generations. Which brings us back to the central impossibility. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates organizational capacity, engineering capability, artistic sophistication, symbolic complexity, and astronomical knowledge at 9,600 BC, 4,000 years before Sumer, 5,000 years before Egypt, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by people inventing civilization. It was built by people who remembered it, by survivors of something earlier, carrying knowledge forward, encoding it in stone because stone survives when everything else perishes. But if Turkey's hilltop temple presents one kind of megalithic impossibility, Lebanon's foundation stones present another, because Göbekli Tepe is impressive for its age. Baalbek is disturbing for its mass. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, beneath the Roman temple of Jupiter Heliopolitanus, lies architectural work that predates Rome by thousands of years. The Romans built on top of something they didn't build, something they couldn't have built with their technology, something that might predate their entire civilization. The foundation of the Jupiter Temple rests on a platform, constructed from some of the largest worked stones ever moved by humans. The trilithon. 3 limestone blocks, each measuring approximately 20 meters long, 4 meters high, and 3 meters deep. The weight of each stone, approximately 800 tons. For context, the largest stones in the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh about 80 tons. The trilithon stones are 10 times that mass, each one. They're precisely cut. Perfect right angles, smooth surfaces, fitted together without mortar with joints so tight that paper can barely slide between them. They rest on a lower course of slightly smaller stones, still massive at 450 tons each. Above the trilithon, the Romans built their temple using stones of mere 50 to 100 tons, which by comparison seem manageable. The technological problem is straightforward. Moving an 800-ton stone requires either A. modern industrial machinery, or B. physics-defying capabilities. Modern heavy-lifting cranes can move objects this size, but they require steel construction, hydraulic systems, computer-calculated load distribution, and reinforced concrete foundations to anchor against. The largest mobile crane in the world, the SGC 250, can lift 5,000 tons but requires months of setup and a crew of specialized engineers. Ancient techniques proposed by archaeologists include massive wooden rollers, thousands of workers pulling ropes, and ingenious lever systems. But these explanations fail basic physics calculations. Wooden rollers large enough to support 800 tons would need to be several meters in diameter and would crush under the load after minimal rotation. Rope made from natural fibers has specific tensile strength limits. Hemp rope, the strongest available in antiquity, breaks at approximately 1,500 kilograms of tension per square centimeter of cross-section. To safely pull 800 tons, you'd need rope so thick and so numerous that the friction alone would prevent movement. And you'd need thousands of workers, which means you'd need to feed and organize thousands of workers for months or years, which requires agricultural surplus, administrative systems, and logistical infrastructure. The standard academic position on Baalbek is that the trilithon was constructed during the Roman period, likely 1st century AD, as part of the temple complex expansion. This dating is based on architectural context and historical records of Roman construction at the site. But there's a problem with this attribution that archaeologists have struggled to address. The trilithon uses a completely different construction technique than Roman work. Roman masonry, even at its most ambitious, uses relatively standardized block sizes that can be managed with period-appropriate technology. 50 to 100 tons is impressive, but achievable with sufficient labor and wooden cranes. The Romans built extensively and left detailed records and architectural evidence of their methods. The trilithon exceeds these methods by an order of magnitude. It's not slightly bigger than Roman capability. It's fundamentally different. As if the Romans built their temple on top of a pre-existing foundation they discovered and couldn't replicate. There's also geological evidence to consider. The stones of the trilithon show significantly more weathering than the Roman construction above them. Erosion patterns, surface degradation, and lichen growth patterns suggest greater age, though dating stone by weathering is imprecise and controversial. In the quarry about 800 meters from Baalbek lies another stone that compounds the mystery, the stone of the pregnant woman, or Hajar el-Hibla, even larger than the trilithon stones, approximately 1,000 tons, partially cut but still attached to bedrock, abandoned mid-process, as if whoever was quarrying it stopped suddenly and never returned. Why would you begin extracting a 1,000-ton stone if you didn't have the technology to move it? Why invest the labor of partial quarrying only to abandon the project? The stone sits in the quarry like an engineering ghost, evidence of ambition or capability we can't explain. The mainstream explanation for Baalbek avoids the central question. Official histories focus on the Roman temple, its religious significance, its architectural achievements. The trilithon is mentioned briefly as a remarkable feat of Roman engineering. The physics problem is left unaddressed, the capability gap is ignored, but the stones exist, 800 tons each, precision cut, moved nearly a kilometer, lifted into place, fitted without mortar, still standing after 2 millennia of earthquakes in a seismically active region. Baalbek's foundation isn't Roman engineering. It's something inherited, something they built on top of without understanding, something that predates their civilization and exceeds their capability. If Baalbek represents mass beyond explanation, then Egypt presents precision beyond explanation. Because the Osirian at Abydos combines both impossibilities, massive stones moved with unknown technology and fitted with tolerances that challenge modern machining. In 1902, British archaeologist Flinders Petrie, excavating behind the temple of Seti Thron at Abydos, discovered a massive subterranean structure, the Osirian, a hall constructed from enormous limestone and granite blocks, some exceeding 100 tons, fitted together with precision that leaves no gaps, no mortar, no visible joining technique. The official dating places the Osirian in the New Kingdom period, contemporary with Seti Thorn's reign around 1300 BC. This dating is based primarily on architectural context, the structure's proximity to Seti's temple, and a few cartouches found in the area bearing Seti's name and those of his grandson Merneptah. But the Osirian doesn't look like New Kingdom architecture. It looks like Old Kingdom Valley Temple construction. Specifically, it resembles the temples beside the Sphinx and the Second Pyramid at Giza, dated to approximately 2500 BC. Same massive limestone and granite blocks, same precision fitting, same austere, undecorated style, same focus on functional architecture rather than ornamental facades. The contradiction is this: if the Osirian was built during the New Kingdom, why does it use architectural methods from 1,000 years earlier? The New Kingdom Egyptians built extensively. We know their techniques. They used smaller stones, more decorative elements, more inscriptions, more paint. They didn't construct massive, undecorated megalithic halls sunk 50 feet below ground level. Unless they didn't build the Osirian. Unless they excavated it. The structure sits buried under millennia of sediment and sand. When Petrie first accessed it, the entire hall was flooded and filled with water. The depth and the sediment layers suggest the structure was built when the water table was much lower, then buried and submerged over time. Geological analysis of erosion patterns and sediment deposition rates points to much greater age than 1300 BC. Some researchers have suggested the Osirian could be contemporary with the Sphinx enclosure, both showing similar water erosion patterns that indicate exposure to significant rainfall. The Egyptian climate transitioned from wet to dry around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Deep water erosion on limestone structures suggests they were exposed during the wet period, which would date them to at least 5,000 BC, possibly much earlier. The precision of the stonework at the Osirian exceeds what bronze tools should achieve. The blocks are fitted so tightly that modern engineers express skepticism about replicating the work without computer-aided design and diamond-tipped cutting tools. The tolerances are measured in fractions of millimeters across surfaces spanning several meters. This isn't approximate fitting. This is machined precision. The mainstream Egyptological position remains firm. The Osirian is New Kingdom, built or commissioned by Seti I in archaic style, as a symbolic connection to earlier periods. The flooding and sediment are explained as natural water table fluctuation and sand accumulation over 3 millennia. The precision is attributed to skilled craftsmen using copper or bronze tools, sand abrasives, and unlimited time. But here's what this explanation requires you to accept: that New Kingdom builders deliberately chose to construct in a style abandoned for 1,000 years, using techniques more difficult than contemporary methods, creating a structure beneath ground level that would immediately flood for symbolic reasons that appear nowhere else in New Kingdom architecture. And that this project left almost no inscriptions, no reliefs, no decorations, no royal propaganda, despite occurring during one of Egypt's most artistically productive periods. The simpler explanation: the Osirian wasn't built during the New Kingdom. It was excavated during the New Kingdom. Seti. I discovered a buried structure, cleared it partially, and built his temple adjacent to it, claiming association with whatever ancient holy site this represented. The cartouches bearing his name are later additions, marking his excavation and restoration work, not original construction. This would explain the architectural anachronism, the depth of burial, the precision that exceeds period capability, and the complete absence of New Kingdom stylistic elements. It would also explain why Egyptian texts refer to Abydos as one of the most ancient sacred sites, associated with Osiris and the mysteries of death and resurrection. Not because Seti built something new, but because something very old was already there. The Osirian isn't New Kingdom revival architecture. It's Old Kingdom foundation they built a temple above. Or possibly pre-Old Kingdom foundation they misunderstood entirely. 3 sites now. 3 different manifestations of megalithic impossibility. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates organizational and engineering capability at 9600 BC that predates agriculture by millennia. Baalbek presents stones whose mass exceeds ancient technological capability by an order of magnitude. The Osirian shows precision fitting that challenges modern machining, buried beneath sediment layers that suggest ages far older than official dating allows. Each site has its academic explanation. Göbekli Tepe is sophisticated hunter-gatherers. Baalbek is Roman engineering feat. The Osirian is New Kingdom archaism. Each explanation treats the site as an isolated challenge to be resolved with the minimum revision to the overall timeline. But together, these sites form a pattern that's harder to dismiss. Advanced megalithic construction, appearing at the earliest periods of known history or before. Precision and mass that exceed available technology. Architectural sophistication that doesn't show developmental stages, but appears fully formed. The pattern suggests that megalithic construction wasn't invented gradually through experimentation. It was inherited, known, understood. And then, like the sophisticated pottery beneath the flood layers at Ur, it was slowly lost. Because if you map megalithic capability over time, you don't see progress. You see regression. The oldest stones are the largest and most precise. Later periods use smaller stones, less precision, more mortar to compensate for gaps, as if each generation retained less knowledge than the previous one, as if they were working from increasingly corrupted copies of an original blueprint they no longer fully understood. Which forces a question: where did the original blueprint come from? The buried cities suggested knowledge that predates known civilization. The megalithic sites confirm that knowledge included engineering principles we still struggle to explain. But if sophisticated settlements existed inland before known history, and impossible stones were erected in the pre-agricultural period, then what lies underwater might reveal when this advanced culture actually flourished. Because water levels are geological clocks, we know precisely when coastlines were where. And what marine archaeology has found in the depths doesn't fit any timeline we're comfortable accepting. The ocean doesn't negotiate with academic consensus. It doesn't care about developmental models or cultural timelines. It simply preserves what sank beneath its surface when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. And what it's been hiding forces us to confront a possibility that archaeology has spent decades avoiding: that the world's oldest cities aren't buried on land. They're drowned off ancient coastlines that have been submerged for 12,000 years. If buried cities suggest a restart, and impossible stones suggest lost knowledge, then drowned cities provide something more definitive: a timeline. Because geology doesn't speculate about sea levels. We know, with precision measured in meters and centuries, exactly where coastlines were at every point during the last 20,000 years. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 18,000 years ago, global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. Massive ice sheets covered North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia, locking up enough water to expose vast continental shelves that are now deep underwater. Coastlines extended hundreds of kilometers beyond their current positions. Land bridges connected continents. The geography of the world looked fundamentally different. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, the ice sheets melted. Water returned to the oceans. Sea levels rose, not gradually, but in pulses. Rapid flooding events, driven by catastrophic ice sheet collapses, could raise global sea levels by meters or tens of meters within decades or centuries. Coastal settlements, if they existed, would have been inundated with little warning. Entire landscapes submerged. Civilizations drowned. The critical insight: if humans established sophisticated cultures on Ice Age coastlines, which would have been prime real estate with moderate temperatures, abundant marine resources, and access to trade routes, those sites are now underwater, 50 meters down, 100 meters down, scattered across the submerged continental shelves that we've barely begun to explore. Marine archaeology operates under severe constraints. Surveying the ocean floor is expensive. Deep water excavation requires specialized equipment, trained divers, and favorable conditions. Visibility is limited. Sediment covers structures. Funding agencies prefer to invest in known sites rather than speculative searches. As a result, we've surveyed less than 5% of the ocean floor with any detail, which means 95% of potential underwater archaeological sites remain undiscovered. And in the small fraction we have explored, we've found things that shouldn't exist according to the standard timeline. The ocean doesn't lie about dates. If a structure sits at a depth that corresponds to sea levels from 10,000 BC, then the structure was built when that area was above water, during the Ice Age, before known civilization, before agriculture, before everything we call history. And what we found at those depths is forcing a confrontation with a possibility archaeology has resisted for decades, that organized, construction-capable cultures existed on Ice Age coastlines and vanished beneath the rising seas, leaving only legends and underwater ruins as evidence of their existence. In 1985, off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, dive tour operator Kihachiro Aratake discovered something that would ignite one of the most heated debates in underwater archaeology: a massive underwater structure lying 25 meters beneath the surface. Terraced platforms, right angles, apparent stairways, flat surfaces extending across hundreds of square meters. The structure, now called the Yonaguni Monument, resembles a stepped pyramid or ziggurat. Multiple levels descend in regular increments, as if deliberately carved or constructed. The edges are sharp, the corners precise, the surfaces flat. It looks architectural, intentional, planned. The academic debate immediately polarized into two camps: natural formation versus man-made structure. Geologists who examined the site noted that the rock is local sandstone, and that sandstone can fracture along natural planes, creating formations that mimic artificial construction. Erosion patterns, tectonic activity, and natural weathering over millennia could, in theory, produce shapes that appear geometric. But underwater structures expert Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, spent years studying the monument and reached a different conclusion. Kimura documented what he identified as tool marks, post holes for wooden structures, carved symbols, and a level of geometric precision that natural geology rarely achieves. He found what appeared to be stone pathways, walls, and even a carved face on one section of the rock. The critical question: when was this structure above water? If it's man-made, dating is straightforward. Sea levels at Yonaguni's location were low enough to expose the site during the late Ice Age, roughly 12,000 years ago. By 8,000 BC, rising seas would have submerged the area. This gives a construction window between approximately 12,000 BC and 8,000 BC. If the Yonaguni monument is artificial, it predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. It predates Göbekli Tepe. It predates Sumerian civilization by 5 millennia. It would represent one of the oldest construction projects in human history. The mainstream position remains skeptical. Most geologists who have examined photographs and sonar data argue for natural formation, citing the regularity of sandstone fracture patterns in the region and the absence of definitive artificial features that can't be explained geologically. No pottery has been recovered from the site. No tools, no inscriptions, no artifacts that would conclusively prove human modification. But this absence of evidence argument has limitations. Stone monuments don't necessarily contain artifacts. Stonehenge has no artifacts embedded in the stones themselves. The artifacts come from the surrounding context: hearths, burials, and domestic refuse in nearby areas. If Yonaguni was a ceremonial platform or a coastal landmark, there's no reason to expect artifact deposits on the structure itself, especially after 12,000 years of submersion and marine erosion. The counter-argument focuses on specific features that geology struggles to explain. The structure includes what appear to be deliberately cut steps of uniform height and width, extending across multiple terraces. Natural fractures don't typically produce uniform step dimensions. There are apparent drainage channels or grooves running along edges, which would serve functional purposes in managing water flow on a constructed platform. There are right-angled turns and intersections that, while not impossible in natural geology, are statistically unlikely to occur in the concentration and arrangement present at Yonaguni. Japan's Marine Geology Research Institute conducted extensive surveys and issued cautious conclusions. The features are difficult to explain as purely natural formations, but definitive proof of human modification remains elusive, which is academic language for. This doesn't look natural, but we can't prove it's artificial with available evidence. The debate remains unresolved, but here's what can't be disputed. If Yonaguni is artificial, then construction-capable cultures existed in East Asia during the Ice Age. If it's natural, then it represents the most architecturally convenient accident in geological history, a random fracture pattern that produces terraced pyramids, uniform steps, and geometric precision exactly where humans would later settle, and exactly in the form humans would later build. Either way, Yonaguni forces us to confront the possibility that the ocean is hiding history we've never explored, and Japan's underwater enigma isn't isolated. Halfway across Asia, in the waters off India's western coast, an even more controversial discovery has emerged from the depths. In 2001 and 2002, marine archaeologists from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology conducting pollution studies in the Gulf of Kambat, detected something unexpected on their side-scan sonar. Massive, regular structures, 40 meters below the surface, grid patterns that resembled urban layouts, what appeared to be building foundations, walls, and organized settlements extending across 9 square kilometers. The team, led by marine scientists S.N. Rajapurohit and later joined by archaeologists, conducted multiple expeditions to investigate. They deployed remote-operated vehicles with cameras, took sonar imaging from multiple angles, and used dredging equipment to retrieve samples from the site. What they brought up from the seafloor reignited debates about pre-Harappan Indian civilization and the possibility of Ice Age urbanism. The artifacts recovered included pottery fragments, beads, semi-precious stones, fossilized wood pieces, and what appeared to be worked stone with tool marks. The team sent organic materials for carbon dating at multiple laboratories. The results came back with dates that shocked the archaeological community: 7,500 BC to 9,500 BC. If accurate, these dates would make the Gulf of Kambat site significantly older than the Indus Valley Civilization, traditionally dated to 3,300 BC. They would make it older than Mehrgar, older than any known Indian settlement, and they would place urban development in India in the same impossible window as Göbekli Tepe. The academic response was swift and dismissive. Criticism focused on multiple fronts. The carbon dating could reflect contamination from older organic material swept into the area by rivers. The sonar images are ambiguous and could represent natural geological formations. The artifacts, while interesting, don't conclusively prove an underwater city. The survey methodology was insufficient. The site needs more extensive excavation before conclusions can be drawn. These criticisms aren't without merit. Marine archaeology is challenging, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Carbon dating organic material dredged from the seafloor is notoriously problematic because rivers carry ancient wood and organic debris from inland areas, depositing them in coastal waters. Dating a piece of wood recovered from the site doesn't definitively date the site itself. But here's what the criticism overlooks. The dates align perfectly with when this area would have been above water. Geologically, the Gulf of Kambat region was exposed land during the Late Ice Age and early Holocene period. Sea level rise between 9,000 BC and 7,000 BC would have gradually inundated the area, submerging any coastal settlements. The radiocarbon dates from Kambat match this inundation timeline precisely. The site also produced multiple types of artifacts from different excavation passes, all dating to the same general period: pottery, beads, construction materials, and fossilized wood. Different material types yielding consistent dates across different labs suggests something more than simple contamination. Contamination is typically random and inconsistent. The Kambat dates cluster around a specific historical window. The sonar imagery, while not conclusive, shows geometric patterns that are difficult to explain as natural formations. Grid-like arrangements, regular spacing, linear features extending for hundreds of meters. Natural geology creates irregular patterns. Rivers deposit sediment in chaotic arrangements. Tectonic activity produces fractures that follow stress patterns, not urban grids. After the initial controversy, funding for further exploration at Kambat dried up. political and academic resistance to the implications made continued investigation difficult. The site remains largely unexplored, its mysteries unresolved, its artifacts sitting in storage, awaiting analysis that never fully materialized. The mainstream rejection of Kambat relies on a familiar pattern: insufficient evidence, need for more research, alternative explanations available, don't draw conclusions from ambiguous data. Each objection is individually reasonable. Together, they function as a defensive barrier against conclusions that would require revising the timeline. But the possibility can't be dismissed that beneath 40 meters of water off India's western coast lie the remains of settlements that were submerged when Ice Age coastlines disappeared. That the Indus Valley civilization wasn't India's first sophisticated culture, but its second or third. That survivors of the submerged coastal cities moved inland and re-established civilization at Mehrgar, at Harappa, carrying with them fragmented knowledge of what was lost. The Gulf of Kambat structures are either the oldest Indian cities by 4,000 years, or the most elaborate geological hoax the ocean ever played. And marine geologists who study the site can't definitively prove which answer is correct, because we lack the resources, the technology, and increasingly, the willingness to find out. If Yonaguni and Kambat represent controversial possibilities, then Pavlopetri represents confirmed reality, because sometimes the underwater cities are undeniable. In 1967, British oceanographer Nick Fleming was surveying the seabed off the southern coast of Greece when he discovered the submerged remains of a Bronze Age city, Pavlopetri. Unlike the controversial sites in Japan and India, Pavlopetri is academically accepted, fully documented, and extensively mapped. The city lies 3 to 4 meters below the surface, preserved in remarkable condition. Streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, and a complex urban layout spanning approximately 50,000 square meters. Dating through pottery analysis places the site's occupation between 3000 BC and 1100 BC, with evidence suggesting it may have been settled even earlier. Pavlopetri was submerged by a combination of tectonic activity and sea level fluctuation. The region is seismically active, and over millennia, gradual subsidence lowered the land while the sea encroached. By around 1000 BC, the city was completely underwater. Why include Pavlopetri in a discussion of controversial underwater sites? Because it proves the principle. Cities do go underwater. When they do, they're preserved. The ocean doesn't destroy evidence. It encases it in sediment and holds it in stasis. Pavlopetri demonstrates that urban structures can survive millennia of submersion and remain identifiable, mappable, and archaeologically valuable. The academic comfort with Pavlopetri stems from its date. 3000 BC is within the established timeline. Bronze Age Greece is known history. The site doesn't challenge any models. It's simply a preserved example of something we already understood existed. But this acceptance highlights a double standard. When underwater sites fit the timeline, like Pavlopetri, they're studied, mapped, and integrated into historical narrative. When underwater sites suggest older dates, like Yonaguni and Kambat, they're dismissed as ambiguous, insufficient, or misinterpreted. The methodology is selective. Accept what fits, dismiss what doesn't. Treat each anomaly as an isolated puzzle, rather than recognize the pattern they create together. Pavlopetri proves ancient cities can be perfectly preserved underwater, which makes the academic resistance to Yonaguni and Kambat even stranger. If Bronze Age cities survived submersion intact, why couldn't Ice Age cities? If tectonic shifts and sea level changes preserved Greek urban layouts at 4 meters depth, why couldn't catastrophic flooding preserve older settlements at 40 meters? The only difference is the date, and the date is precisely what we're questioning. Between Britain and Europe lies a vast, drowned landscape that adds another dimension to the underwater city hypothesis: Doggerland, an Ice Age landmass connecting the British Isles to continental Europe, now submerged beneath the North Sea. At its peak, Doggerland covered approximately 180,000 square kilometers. It wasn't marginal land. It was rich, resource-abundant territory with rivers, lakes, forests, and abundant wildlife. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today, Doggerland was the heartland of northwestern Europe. People lived there. We know this because fishermen regularly trawl up evidence from the North Sea floor: mammoth bones, stone tools, antlers, occasionally even human remains. Dutch fishing boats have recovered thousands of artifacts over the past century, each one confirmation that Doggerland was inhabited. Recent geological surveys using advanced sonar and seismic imaging have begun mapping Doggerland's topography. The data reveals a landscape of river valleys, hills, coastlines, and what appear to be possible settlement sites. The surveys have identified areas with regular formations that might indicate human modification, though confirmation requires underwater excavation that hasn't yet occurred. The mainstream acknowledgement of Doggerland is cautious. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived there. The implication is that these were small, nomadic groups with minimal infrastructure, simple campsites, temporary shelters, nothing that would qualify as urban or architecturally significant. But here's the unasked question: if hunter-gatherers left detectable traces on Doggerland, stone tools, hearths, food refuse, what would more advanced groups have left? If Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that pre-agricultural populations could construct monumental architecture, and if coastal regions during the Ice Age offered even more abundant resources than interior highlands, then why assume Doggerland's inhabitants were less sophisticated than contemporary inland groups? Doggerland was submerged relatively recently in geological terms. The final inundation occurred around 6,500 BC, when a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami that swept across the North Sea. The Storegga Slide. Geological evidence shows catastrophic flooding, with wave heights possibly reaching 25 meters. Any settlements on Doggerland's remaining lowlands would have been obliterated instantly. Before the tsunami, Doggerland had already been shrinking for millennia as sea levels gradually rose. By 8000 BC, it was reduced to a low-lying archipelago. By 6500 BC, it vanished entirely. If organized settlements existed there, they're now buried under sediment at the bottom of the North Sea, and we've surveyed perhaps 1% of that seabed with sufficient resolution to detect architectural remains. The pattern expands. Doggerland joins Yonaguni, Kambat, and countless other submerged landscapes as potential repositories of lost history. Every Ice Age coastline now underwater represents thousands of kilometers of potential settlement areas that we've never explored. Modern humans existed for tens of thousands of years before the dates we assign to first civilizations. For most of that time, they lived on coastlines that are now submerged. We've found their tools on drowned landscapes. We've found their refuse in underwater caves. We've found their art in flooded passages. We know they were there. The question isn't whether people lived on Ice Age coastlines. The question is, how sophisticated were they? And if some groups achieved the level of organization necessary to build Göbekli Tepe in the interior highlands, what did coastal groups, with access to abundant marine resources, moderate climates, and natural harbors, achieve in the same period? Marine archaeology can't answer this question yet, because we lack the resources and technology to conduct comprehensive surveys of submerged continental shelves. The ocean is vast. The equipment is expensive. The political will is absent. And, perhaps most significantly, the academic establishment has little incentive to fund searches for evidence that would overturn established timelines. So, the drowned cities remain hypothetical, except for the ones we've already found and chosen to dismiss: the geometric terraces at Yonaguni, the grid patterns at Kambat, the unexamined formations on Doggerland's seabed, the countless sonar anomalies detected by fishermen, oil surveyors, and naval mapping projects that never receive archaeological follow-up. How many cities are we missing? How much history lies beneath 100 meters of water, buried under millennia of marine sediment waiting for someone to look? The pattern now includes 3 layers of evidence. Buried cities beneath known civilizations, showing sophistication without developmental stages. Impossible megalithic construction, appearing at the earliest dates with precision we can't replicate. And drowned structures on ancient coastlines that were above water only during the Ice Age and early Holocene period. Each layer, examined independently, can be explained away with sufficient academic creativity. Buried cities are local flooding. Megalithic precision is underestimated ancient capability. Underwater structures are natural formations, or insufficient evidence. But together, they form a pattern that points toward a single conclusion. Organized, construction-capable cultures existed before the accepted timeline. They built on coastlines that are now submerged. They established inland settlements that were buried by flooding and sediment. They created megalithic monuments encoding knowledge they wanted to preserve. And they were destroyed by catastrophic climate events at the end of the Ice Age. This isn't speculation. This is what the evidence suggests when you stop treating each discovery as an isolated anomaly and start recognizing the pattern they create together. And if the physical evidence, buried cities, impossible stones, drowned structures, forms one pattern, then the stories ancient cultures told about their origins form another. Because every major civilization that left written records described the same event: a catastrophic flood that destroyed an earlier world. Academic historians dismiss these stories as myths, local flood memories exaggerated into cosmic narratives, religious allegories about sin and punishment, universal archetypes of destruction and renewal that emerge independently across cultures. But what if the stories aren't myths? What if they're history, cultural memory of the same geological catastrophe, transmitted through oral tradition for millennia before being written down? Distributed accounts of the same event, the rapid sea level rise and catastrophic flooding that occurred between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, when Ice Age civilizations were drowned beneath rising seas. The flood narratives don't just describe water. They describe the end of a world and the beginning of another, the destruction of an earlier humanity and the survival of a remnant, the loss of knowledge and the struggle to rebuild. And when you read these narratives not as religious mythology but as attempted historical accounts of geological catastrophe, they align precisely with what archaeology, marine geology, and climate science tell us actually happened at the end of the Ice Age. The stories ancient people told about floods aren't fantasies, they're memories, and the pattern those memories describe matches the pattern we've been tracing through buried cities, drowned structures, and impossible stones. Every major ancient culture has a flood story. The academic treatment of this fact is remarkably consistent. These are regional floods mythologized into universal catastrophes, local disasters exaggerated through generations of oral transmission until they became cosmic events, cultural archetypes that emerge independently because humans everywhere fear water and create similar cautionary tales. This explanation is tidy. It preserves the assumption that ancient people were recording religious mythology rather than historical memory. It allows scholars to acknowledge the existence of the narratives while dismissing their content as symbolic rather than literal. But here's the problem that this explanation never adequately addresses. The details match across cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. Same timeline, deep antiquity, before recorded history, same cause, divine response to human corruption or overpopulation, same survivors, a righteous remnant warned in advance, same method of survival, boats or rafts carrying people, animals, and knowledge. Same result, civilization restart by survivors who preserved fragments of the old world. The specificity of these parallels is difficult to explain as independent invention. If flood myths were simply universal archetypes emerging from shared human psychology, we'd expect generic narratives about water-destroying communities. Instead, we get detailed accounts with matching structural elements, consistent timelines, and overlapping specifics. Coincidence, or memory, cultural mythology, or distributed historical record of the same catastrophic event, transmitted through oral tradition across continents and millennia before being codified in written form. What if the flood myths aren't myths at all? What if they're the historical record of what buried those cities and drowned those coastlines? What if every ancient culture that developed writing independently preserved the same story because their ancestors survived the same catastrophe? The pattern suggests something uncomfortable, that the stories ancient people told about their past might be more reliable than modern historians have been willing to accept. The oldest written flood narrative comes from Mesopotamia, preserved on clay tablets that predate the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled in its most complete form around 2200 BC, but drawing from older Sumerian sources, includes a detailed flood story in its 11th tablet. Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, travels to find Utnapishtim, the only human granted eternal life by the gods. When they meet, Utnapishtim explains how he earned this gift, by surviving the great flood that destroyed humanity. The account is specific. The gods decided to send a deluge to eliminate humanity because human noise and population growth had become unbearable. Ea, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim in a dream, instructing him to build a boat. The specifications are precise. A cube-shaped vessel, 120 cubits on each side, 6 decks, divided into compartments, waterproofed with bitumen. Utnapishtim gathered his family, craftsmen, animals, and seed of all living things. The flood came. It raged for 6 days and 7 nights. When the waters receded, the boat grounded on a mountain. Utnapishtim released birds to test for dry land, a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven that didn't return, indicating land was available. The survivors disembarked. Utnapishtim made offerings to the gods. The gods, realizing they had nearly destroyed all life, granted him immortality as recognition of his role in preserving creation. This isn't vague mythology. It's a narrative with architectural specifications, chronological sequences, and procedural details. The kind of specificity that appears in historical accounts, not symbolic allegories. An even older Mesopotamian text, the Atrahasis, dated to approximately 1800 BC, but based on sources from 2100 BC or earlier, provides additional details. In this version, the gods send the flood because humanity has multiplied too greatly and become too loud, disturbing the divine rest. The god Enki warns Atrahasis, who builds a boat and preserves life. After the flood, the survivors restart civilization. The critical detail in Atrahasis that appears nowhere in later retellings. When the deluge came, survivors saw nothing but water everywhere. This description doesn't fit river flooding, even catastrophic river flooding. The Euphrates and Tigris flood regularly, but survivors would see land in some direction. The Atrahasis text describes complete inundation, water in every direction, as far as the eye could see. This describes either massive sea level rise or catastrophic coastal inundation. The kind of flooding that occurs when ocean waters surge inland, overwhelming river valleys and low-lying regions. The kind of flooding that would have accompanied rapid meltwater pulses at the end of the Ice Age. The archaeological context supports this interpretation. Woolley's flood layer at Ur, the multiple flood strata at Eridu, the buried cities separated by water-deposited sediment. These aren't evidence of annual river floods. They're evidence of extraordinary inundation events that buried entire settlements and forced survivors to rebuild on top of the devastation. The Mesopotamian flood tradition isn't religious allegory. It's cultural memory preserved in epic form. The details, boat construction, bird releases, mountain grounding, civilization restart, are too specific to be pure invention. They're the kind of details that survive in oral tradition when people are describing real events, not creating fables. And Mesopotamia isn't the only culture that preserved this memory. The biblical account in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 preserves the same narrative structure with nearly identical details. God decides to flood the earth because of human wickedness. Noah, a righteous man, receives warning. He builds an ark according to precise specifications, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks, door in the side, waterproofed with pitch. He loads his family, pairs of animals, and provisions. The flood comes, covering the highest mountains. The waters prevail for 150 days. The ark grounds on Mount Ararat. Noah releases birds, a raven, then doves, to test for dry land. The survivors disembark and restart humanity. The academic consensus on the Genesis flood is that the biblical authors borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian sources, particularly during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes would have had access to Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. This explains the transmission of the narrative from Sumerian to Hebrew culture. But this explanation addresses only the mechanism of transmission, not the origin of the story. Why did Sumerians preserve this narrative in the first place? If it's pure mythology, why these specific details? Why the insistence on architectural precision in boat construction? Why the chronological sequence of flood duration? Why the repeated motif of bird releases as a navigation technique? The Genesis account adds theological interpretation, sin and judgment, covenant and redemption, but beneath the religious overlay, the structure matches the Mesopotamian versions precisely. Same catastrophe, same warning, same preservation method, same restart. More significantly, Genesis preserves a detail that modern readers often overlook. The pre-flood world was different. Genesis describes the Nephilim, beings of superior size and capability, who existed before the flood. It mentions sons of God and daughters of men, producing offspring who were mighty men of old, men of renown. These passages are typically interpreted as angels or kings, but the text describes them as possessing knowledge and capability that exceeded normal humans. What if Genesis preserves fragmented memory of a pre-flood population that had achieved greater technological sophistication? What if the Nephilim and mighty men of old are garbled references to the builders of the buried cities, the engineers who moved the megalithic stones, the sophisticated coastal populations who were drowned when sea levels rose? The Genesis flood isn't proof of global inundation, but it's another data point in a pattern that spans cultures and continents. A pattern that consistently points backward to something older, something destroyed by water, something that had to be rebuilt by survivors. Greek tradition preserves the same pattern through multiple flood narratives, the most prominent being the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus, angered by human corruption during the Bronze Age, decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest or ark and survives the deluge with his wife Pyrrha. After 9 days, their vessel grounds on Mount Parnassus. They emerge to find the world empty. An oracle instructs them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders, interpreting this as stones from the earth. They throw rocks, which become humans, men from stones thrown by Deucalion, women from stones thrown by Pyrrha. The stone-throwing detail is typically read as origin mythology, but it functions as a cultural metaphor for civilizational rebuilding. After catastrophe, survivors must reconstruct society from basic elements, like forming humans from stones. It's a poetic way of describing the restart process, taking raw materials and rebuilding organized culture from scratch. Deucalion's flood is dated in Greek tradition to approximately 1500 BC, but other Greek sources reference earlier floods. Plato, in Timaeus and Critias, presents what might be the most significant flood account in Western literature: the story of Atlantis. The account comes to Plato through his ancestor, Solon, who visited Egypt around 600 BC and conversed with priests at Sais. These priests told Solon that Greeks were like children, with no knowledge of antiquity. The Egyptians, they claimed, possessed records going back thousands of years, including accounts of multiple catastrophes that destroyed civilizations. One such account described Atlantis, an advanced island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, powerful and sophisticated, possessing superior engineering and naval capabilities. This civilization existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing it at approximately 9,600 BC. Atlantis conquered parts of the Mediterranean, but was eventually defeated by Athens. Shortly after, both civilizations were destroyed by earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis sank beneath the waves, and the Athenian army was swallowed by the earth. The mainstream interpretation of Atlantis has always been that Plato invented it as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris and imperial overreach, a thought experiment to explore his political theories. The story is too convenient, too perfectly structured as a moral lesson, to be historical. Arguments for this interpretation are substantial. Plato never mentions Atlantis in other dialogues where it would be relevant. The story serves his philosophical purposes too perfectly. No other Greek source mentions Atlantis before Plato. The entire account might be sophisticated fiction, but there are counter-arguments that receive less attention. Plato frames the Atlantis story as history multiple times throughout Timaeus and Critias. He emphasizes that this is an account transmitted by Egyptian priests, not his invention. He never does this with acknowledged fables or thought experiments elsewhere in his work. When Plato creates allegories, like the cave or the ring of Gyges, he doesn't insist they're historical. With Atlantis, he repeatedly emphasizes its factual basis. The date he provides, 9,600 BC, is eerily specific, and it aligns precisely with the multiple patterns we've been tracing. 9,600 BC corresponds to the end of the Younger Dryas period, the catastrophic climate event that marked the rapid transition from Ice Age to warming. It aligns with the construction date of Göbekli Tepe. It aligns with the period when rapid sea level rise would have inundated coastal settlements. It aligns with the window when Ice Age civilizations, if they existed, would have been destroyed. Plato's description of Atlantis includes details that match nothing in his philosophical system, but match geological and archaeological reality. He describes an island civilization dependent on naval power, exactly what would develop on stable Ice Age coastlines with access to abundant marine resources. He describes concentric rings of water and land, advanced harbor engineering, sophisticated architecture, all capabilities that coastal populations with centuries of development would possess. He describes sudden destruction by earthquake and flood, exactly what would occur during catastrophic tectonic events combined with rapid sea level rise in the Mediterranean region. If Plato invented Atlantis as allegory, why these specific details? Why the precise date that aligns with actual geological catastrophe? Why the emphasis on advanced coastal civilization destroyed by water, which matches the pattern of drowned Ice Age settlements? The simpler explanation: Plato's account is a garbled memory of a real catastrophe. Not necessarily an island called Atlantis, with the exact features he describes, but a template based on Egyptian records of Ice Age coastal civilizations destroyed during the transition to the Holocene. The Egyptian priests preserved fragmentary accounts of earlier sophisticated cultures that were inundated when sea levels rose. Solon heard these accounts. The story was transmitted through Plato's family. Plato recorded it, adding his own philosophical interpretations and possibly conflating multiple sources. Atlantis, as Plato described it, probably doesn't exist. But the template, advanced coastal civilization destroyed by water around 9600 BC, matches the pattern we've been documenting across continents and disciplines. Hindu tradition preserves flood narratives that add another dimension to the global pattern. The Matsya Purana, one of 18 major Puranas dating to approximately 300 AD, but drawing from much older oral tradition, describes the flood of Manu. Manu, the first man, finds a small fish that asks for protection. Manu places the fish in a jar, then a tank, then a river, then the ocean as it grows. The fish, revealed to be Vishnu in disguise, warns Manu of an impending deluge that will destroy all life. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a boat and gather the 7 sages, seeds of all plants, and pairs of animals. The flood comes. Manu's boat survives. Tethered to the horn of the Matsya, fish form of Vishnu. After the waters recede, Manu becomes the progenitor of the new humanity. The structure matches Mesopotamian and Hebrew accounts precisely. Warning from divine source. Boat construction. Preservation of life and knowledge. Restart of civilization. Even the detail of the boat being secured during the flood, tethered to Vishnu's horn in Hindu tradition, grounding on a mountain in Mesopotamian and Hebrew tradition, shows parallel narrative development. But Hindu tradition adds a critical element that other cultures don't emphasize as explicitly: cyclical time. Hindu cosmology doesn't view civilization as linear. It's cyclical. The universe moves through yugas, vast ages that repeat. Each yuga ends in destruction and is followed by renewal. We live in the Kali Yuga, the 4th and final age in the current cycle, which will end in destruction before beginning again. This isn't myth in the Western sense. It's historiography, a model of time that accommodates repeated civilizational collapses and restarts, a framework that expects knowledge to be lost and rediscovered cyclically rather than accumulating linearly. The flood of Manu isn't presented as a unique event in cosmic history. It's one iteration of a repeating pattern. Previous worlds were destroyed by water. Future worlds will be destroyed and rebuilt. Civilization rises, achieves sophistication, collapses, and is restarted by survivors who carry fragments of the old world into the new. This framework actually matches the archaeological pattern better than linear models. Buried cities beneath known civilizations. Sophisticated capability appearing without developmental stages. Knowledge systems that seem inherited rather than invented. All of this makes more sense if civilization is cyclical rather than singular. Hindu tradition isn't offering mythology. It's offering a different historical model, one that accounts for what the evidence actually shows. Civilization didn't begin once. It's begun multiple times, after multiple collapses, with each restart building on fragmented memories of what came before. Native American cultures, separated from Old World civilizations by oceans and supposedly developing in complete isolation, preserve remarkably similar flood traditions. The parallels are difficult to explain through independent invention. Hopi tradition speaks of 4 worlds. we live in the fourth world. The three previous worlds were destroyed, one by fire, one by ice, one by water. The third world's destruction is particularly detailed. Moral corruption led to divine judgment. The world was flooded, and only righteous people who climbed into hollow reeds survived. They emerged into the fourth world and re-established civilization. Lakota tradition describes a great flood sent by the Creator to cleanse the earth. Survivors took refuge on a mountain peak that remained above water. After the flood receded, they descended and repopulated the earth. Ojibwe tradition preserves the narrative of Nanabojo, a cultural hero who survived a great flood by building a raft and floating for many days until the waters receded. He sent animals to dive and retrieve soil from beneath the water, eventually gathering enough to recreate land. Aztec cosmology divides history into 5 suns, 5 ages, each ending in catastrophe. The fourth sun, called Nahui-Atl, was destroyed by a great flood lasting 52 years. Only 1 man and 1 woman survived by hiding in a hollow tree. They became the ancestors of the current age. The specificity of these accounts is striking. Not vague, water destroyed our ancestors, but detailed narratives with common elements: moral judgment, divine warning, specific survival methods, duration of flooding, restart of humanity by remnant population. These cultures had no contact with Mesopotamia, Egypt, or India during the periods when these flood traditions were codified. They developed writing systems independently and recorded their own histories in isolation from Old World civilizations. Yet, their flood narratives share structural elements, chronological frameworks, and survival details that parallel accounts from continents away. The orthodox explanation: flood myths are universal archetypes that emerge independently because all human cultures experience flooding and fear water. This psychological explanation accounts for the existence of flood myths, but not their specificity. Why do so many cultures describe precisely similar survival methods, boats or rafts carrying people and animals? Why do they describe similar durations, days or weeks of flooding? Why do they describe similar restart processes, remnant populations rebuilding from knowledge preserved by survivors? If these were independent psychological archetypes, we'd expect more variation in details. Instead, we see convergence, as if different cultures are describing different perspectives on the same event, transmitted through different languages and mythological frameworks, but preserving the same core memory. The alternative explanation: these aren't independent inventions. They're distributed cultural memory of actual catastrophic flooding that occurred globally during the transition from Ice Age to Holocene, when ice sheets collapsed and meltwater pulses raised sea levels by tens of meters over decades or centuries. Coastal populations worldwide would have experienced catastrophic inundation. Survivors would have fled inland, carrying oral traditions of the disaster. These traditions would have been transmitted through generations, eventually codified in written form when writing systems developed. The flood myths converge on the same timeline: deep antiquity, before recorded history, in the time of ancestors. This timeline corresponds to 12,000–8000 BC, the period of maximum climatic instability and rapid sea level rise, the period when Ice Age coastal civilizations, if they existed, would have been destroyed. The myths converge on the same cause: divine judgment for moral corruption. This could be theological interpretation added over millennia of transmission, or it could preserve memory of social collapse preceding environmental catastrophe. Civilizations under stress often experience moral degradation, violence, and social fragmentation before final collapse. The myths converge on the same result. Civilization restart by survivors who preserved knowledge. This matches the archaeological pattern exactly. Sophisticated capabilities appearing in post-flood settlements without visible development. Knowledge systems that seem inherited. Cultural traditions claiming ancient origins. We now have global narrative agreement. Civilization existed before known history, was destroyed by water, restarted by survivors who preserved knowledge. Orthodox historians dismiss this as universal flood archetype. Humans near rivers fear floods, psychological inevitability. But this dismissal doesn't explain why dates cluster around 10,000 BC across cultures. Doesn't explain why stories emphasize knowledge preservation, not just survival. Doesn't explain why they describe global destruction, not local flooding. Doesn't explain the convergent details in cultures that never contacted each other. The pattern suggests something simpler: distributed cultural memory of the same event. Multiple cultures preserving oral tradition of catastrophic flooding that destroyed earlier civilization, transmitted across millennia, eventually written down when writing systems emerged, which means the next question isn't whether the flood myths are real. The question is, what geological evidence exists for catastrophic global flooding during the period the myths describe? Because if the myths are memory, not mythology, then geology should show evidence of the catastrophe. And if geology confirms catastrophic flooding between 12,000 and 8,000 BC, then the myths stop being myths. They become the historical record. Mythology is dismissed as unreliable. Oral tradition is treated as corrupted memory, distorted through generations until fact becomes fable. Ancient texts are read as religious allegory rather than historical documentation. This dismissal is academically convenient because it allows scholars to acknowledge the existence of flood narratives without confronting their implications. But geology doesn't speculate. Geology doesn't have theological agendas or cultural biases. Geology simply records what happened to the planet, layer by layer, isotope by isotope, sediment by sediment. And the geological record of the period 12,000 to 8,000 BC, the precise window described in global flood myths, is catastrophic. We're not talking about gradual climate change or slow environmental shifts that allowed populations to adapt over generations. We're talking about rapid, devastating, civilization-ending events, sudden temperature swings, massive ice sheet collapses, sea level rises measured in meters per century or even per decade, catastrophic flooding on continental scales, possible cosmic impacts, megafauna extinctions, and all of this compressed into a 4,000-year window. If advanced cultures existed on Ice Age coastlines, this is when they died, and geology shows exactly how. The story begins with the Younger Dryas, one of the most abrupt and severe climate events in recent geological history. Around 12,900 BC, just as the planet was warming and ice sheets were retreating, temperatures suddenly plummeted. The Ice Age returned, not gradually over centuries, but rapidly, possibly within decades. Global temperatures dropped by approximately 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. Glaciers that had been melting began advancing again. Ecosystems that had adapted to warming conditions were devastated. This sudden climate reversal lasted 1,200 years, from roughly 12,900 BC to 11,700 BC. Then, just as abruptly, temperatures spiked upward again, rising perhaps even faster than they had fallen. The world lurched from ice age to warming within a generation. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains debated, but evidence increasingly points toward extraterrestrial impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposed in 2007 and refined through subsequent research, suggests that a cosmic impact or airburst over North America triggered the sudden cooling. The evidence includes a layer of sediment dated precisely to the onset of the Younger Dryas containing unusual materials, nanodiamonds, which form under extreme heat and pressure, microspherules, tiny glass beads created by intense heat, platinum and iridium anomalies, elements rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets, and a carbon-rich layer indicating massive biomass burning across North America. This evidence appears at dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all dated to the same narrow window, all containing the same signatures of cosmic impact or atmospheric explosion. The hypothesis remains controversial. Some geologists argue the evidence could have alternative explanations: volcanic eruption, wildfires, or natural concentration of exotic materials through geological processes. But as more sites are analyzed and more data accumulated, the impact scenario becomes harder to dismiss. Recent studies from the 2020s have identified additional impact markers, including shocked quartz and melt glass, at sites spanning multiple continents. If the impact occurred, the immediate effects would have been catastrophic for any human populations in the affected regions. An airburst or impact large enough to trigger global climate shifts would have released energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The blast zone would have been incinerated. Shock waves would have flattened forests across thousands of square kilometers. Massive wildfires would have consumed vegetation. Dust and debris ejected into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, triggering rapid cooling. The secondary effects would have been even more devastating. The sudden temperature drop would have disrupted agriculture if it existed. Cooling would have killed temperate plant species and forced migrations of animals that humans depended on for food. Glacier advance would have made some regions uninhabitable. The environmental instability would have persisted for over 1,000 years, roughly 40 generations. If organized human populations existed at 13,000 BC, the Younger Dryas would have been their apocalypse. Settlements destroyed by direct impact effects. Agricultural systems, if they existed, collapsed by sudden cooling. Trade networks severed by population displacement. Knowledge systems fragmented as communities scattered and died. The megafauna extinctions support this catastrophe scenario. Between 13,000 BC and 11,000 BC, North America lost approximately 70% of its large mammal species: woolly mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, American lions, horses, camels, all disappeared within this narrow window. Europe and Asia experienced similar mass extinctions, though not as severe as North America. The mainstream explanation for these extinctions has been human overhunting, the overkill hypothesis. As human populations expanded and hunting technology improved, the theory goes, we simply killed off the megafauna. But this explanation has never adequately accounted for the speed of the extinctions or their synchronicity with climate change. Species that had survived previous warming periods, previous human expansion, and hundreds of thousands of years of predation suddenly went extinct simultaneously across continents. The impact hypothesis provides a more comprehensive explanation. Direct kill zone from the impact or airburst, massive habitat destruction from wildfires, climate instability preventing population recovery, and, yes, human hunting pressure as a contributing factor, but within a context of environmental catastrophe that made survival impossible for large, slow-breeding species. For human populations, the disappearance of megafauna would have been devastating. These animals were primary food sources for Paleolithic peoples. When they vanished, human societies dependent on hunting them would have faced starvation, forced migration, and social collapse. Any complex cultures that had developed during the stable Late Ice Age would have been unable to maintain themselves during the chaos of the Younger Dryas, which means if sophisticated populations existed before 13,000 BC, the Younger Dryas is when their knowledge would have been lost. Survivors would have scattered. Written records, if they existed, would have been lost. Architectural knowledge would have persisted only in oral tradition. Survivors emerging from the Younger Dryas around 11,700 BC would have had to rebuild civilization from fragmented memories, and the timing aligns. Göbekli Tepe, constructed around 9,600 BC, represents one of the first major architectural projects after the Younger Dryas. If it was built by survivors or descendants of survivors, the sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge encoded in the site makes more sense, not as invention by hunter-gatherers, but as reconstruction by people preserving inherited knowledge. But if the Younger Dryas was the catastrophe that destroyed pre-Ice Age civilization, the end of the Younger Dryas is what drowned it. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,700 BC, temperatures didn't just return to pre-cooling levels. They spiked. Rapidly, ice sheets that had been stable or advancing began melting at catastrophic rates. And when continental ice sheets collapse, the water has to go somewhere. It goes into the oceans, and sea levels rise. Between 18,000 BC and 8,000 BC, global sea levels rose approximately 120 meters. But this rise wasn't gradual. It came in pulses, periods of rapid melt alternating with relative stability. The most dramatic pulses occurred around 14,000 BC and 11,500 BC, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A and Meltwater Pulse 1B. Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurring around 14,000 BC, raised sea levels by 16 to 25 meters within less than 500 years. That's approximately 4 to 5 centimeters per year on average. But the rise likely came in surges, years where sea level jumped by meters as massive sections of ice sheet collapsed into the ocean. For coastal populations, this would have been apocalyptic. Imagine living in a coastal city and watching the ocean rise 4 centimeters every year, 50 centimeters per decade, 5 meters per century. Within a single human lifetime, coastlines would have moved kilometers inland. Villages would have been swallowed, ports submerged, entire landscapes drowned. But Meltwater Pulse 1A was only the first wave. Meltwater pulse 1b, occurring around 11,500 BC at the end of the Younger Dryas, raised sea levels another 20 meters in similar time frame. This pulse coincides with the abrupt temperature spike that ended the Younger Dryas. As ice sheets that had been stable during the cold period suddenly melted, water poured into the oceans at rates that would have caused catastrophic flooding along every coastline on Earth. The total sea level rise from 18,000 BC to 8,000 BC, 120 meters, is difficult to visualize. But consider this. If 120 meters of water were added to modern oceans, London would be completely submerged. New York would be underwater to the tops of skyscrapers. Tokyo, Mumbai, Shanghai, Los Angeles, gone. Every coastal city on Earth would cease to exist. Hundreds of millions of people would be displaced, trillions of dollars in infrastructure destroyed. Now consider that during the Ice Age, when sea levels were 120 meters lower, humans preferentially settled coasts. Coastal regions offered abundant food from marine resources, moderate temperatures, access to water, and natural harbors for primitive boats. If humans achieved any level of sophistication during the Ice Age, they would have built their most advanced settlements on coastlines. All of those coastlines are now underwater. Every Ice Age coastal city, if they existed, would now be 50 to 120 meters below current sea level, scattered across the submerged continental shelves that we've surveyed less than 5% of, hidden beneath millennia of marine sediment, accessible only through expensive, difficult underwater archaeology that has barely begun, which is exactly where Yonaguni and Kambat are, at depths corresponding to Ice Age coastlines, in positions that would have been prime coastal real estate during the late Ice Age, submerged precisely when meltwater pulses would have inundated them. The pattern matches. The geology confirms what the myths describe: catastrophic flooding that destroyed coastal settlements, forcing survivors to flee inland and rebuild what they could salvage from memory. But meltwater pulses weren't the only flooding mechanism during this period. Regional catastrophes added to the global sea level crisis, creating localized disasters that may have contributed to flood narratives in specific cultures. The Black Sea Deluge Hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, suggests that the Black Sea was a freshwater lake until approximately 5,600 BC, when rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the natural dam at the Bosphorus Strait. When the breach occurred, Mediterranean water poured into the Black Sea basin at catastrophic rates. Estimates suggested the equivalent of 200 Niagara Falls, raising the Black Sea's water level by 50 to 100 meters within months or years. The evidence for this event is compelling. Marine surveys of the Black Sea floor have identified ancient shorelines, now submerged at depths corresponding to the proposed lake level. Sediment cores show a sharp transition from freshwater to saltwater deposits around 5,600 BC. Submerged archaeological sites on what would have been the ancient coastline have been detected but not fully excavated. The flooding layer is remarkably uniform across the basin, suggesting rapid, catastrophic inundation rather than gradual sea level rise. If the Black Sea deluge occurred as proposed, any human settlements around the lakeshore would have been destroyed with minimal warning. People living on the coast would have seen water advancing kilometers per day, villages submerged, farmland inundated, entire communities forced to flee inland with whatever they could carry. Some researchers have proposed that the Black Sea deluge is the historical basis for Noah's flood narrative. The timeline doesn't match perfectly. 5600 BC is significantly later than the major meltwater pulses, but the Black Sea region is close to Mesopotamia, and flood memories could have been transmitted through migration and cultural contact. The hypothesis remains debated, but it demonstrates an important principle. Catastrophic regional flooding events are geologically documented. They're not myth. They happened, and they would have been civilization-ending for populations in affected areas. The Mediterranean basin experienced similar catastrophic events. The region is tectonically active, with frequent earthquakes and periodic volcanic eruptions. The most famous example from historical periods is the Thera eruption around 1600 BC, which destroyed the Minoan civilization and generated tsunamis that devastated Mediterranean coastlines. But Thera is recent history. The relevant question is, what happened during the critical period of 12,000 to 8,000 BC? The Mediterranean was experiencing the same global sea level rise as every other ocean. Combine rising seas with regional tectonic activity, earthquakes triggering tsunamis, volcanic eruptions causing localized climate disruption, and you have a recipe for repeated coastal catastrophes throughout the Mediterranean during precisely the period when flood myths describe civilizational collapse. Recent geological surveys have identified multiple layers of tsunami deposits along Mediterranean coastlines dated to the early Holocene period. These aren't singular events. They're evidence of repeated catastrophic flooding over millennia. Any coastal settlements in the Mediterranean during this period would have been under constant threat. Build too close to the water, and the next tsunami destroys your village. Build inland for safety, and rising sea levels gradually push you further from the coast and the marine resources you depend on. The pattern emerges clearly when you map the geological evidence. Between 13,000 BC and 8,000 BC, Earth experienced unprecedented environmental instability, sudden climate reversal, possible cosmic impact, megafauna extinctions, then rapid warming, massive ice sheet collapse, sea level rise of 120 meters in 10,000 years, coming in catastrophic pulses, regional flooding events, tectonic activity, tsunami events, climate zones shifting, ecosystems collapsing and reforming. This wasn't a gradual transition that allowed adaptation. This was chaos, sustained environmental catastrophe lasting thousands of years. Any organized human populations existing during this period would have been systematically destroyed, not by a single flood event, but by cascading catastrophes that made stable civilization impossible. Survivors would have been traumatized populations carrying fragmentary memories of what was lost. They would have told their children about the time before the chaos, about the cities that existed when the water was lower, about the knowledge that was lost when the world changed. These memories would have been transmitted orally for generations, distorted over time, mixed with religious interpretation, eventually codified in written form as flood myths. The geological record confirms what the myths describe: not a single global flood event, but a period of catastrophic environmental instability that would have destroyed Ice Age civilizations if they existed. The dates match. The mechanisms match. The global distribution matches. Which means the flood myths aren't myths. They're history, cultural memory of real geological catastrophe, transmitted through oral tradition, preserved in the oldest texts of every major civilization. And if the geology confirms the catastrophe and the myths preserve the memory, then the inheritance systems start making sense. Because if you survived the collapse of civilization, witnessed the destruction of cities, and the loss of knowledge, you would become obsessed with preservation. How do you pass information across dark ages? How do you encode knowledge so it survives when writing systems collapse and institutions fall? You build in stone. You encode in myth. You create priesthoods to guard the knowledge. You establish initiatory systems that restrict access to preserve accuracy. You embed mathematical constants in architecture, so the information persists even when the meaning is forgotten. You create exactly the inheritance systems that appear in early post-Ice Age civilizations. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe, the mathematical precision at Giza, the mystery schools in Egypt and Greece, the Vedic oral traditions in India, the megalithic monuments scattered across the globe. These aren't primitive superstitions. They're sophisticated information preservation protocols designed by survivors of catastrophe who understood that knowledge must be encoded in forms that transcend individual human lifespans, institutional collapse, and environmental disaster. The pattern is complete. The buried cities showed sophisticated organization appearing without development. The megaliths showed impossible engineering appearing at the earliest dates. The drowned structures showed cities on Ice Age coastlines. The flood myths showed global cultural memory of catastrophe. And now geology confirms the catastrophe was real. All that remains is to examine the inheritance mechanisms themselves, to see how post-catastrophe civilizations encoded and preserved fragments of pre-catastrophe knowledge, to understand what the astronomical alignments, mathematical constants, mystery schools, and ancient wisdom traditions actually represent, not primitive religion, not superstitious rituals, but emergency protocols, knowledge preservation systems designed by people who had watched their world end and were determined that the next civilization wouldn't lose everything they had lost. If a pre-Ice Age civilization was destroyed around 10,000 BC, survivors would face a specific problem: how to preserve critical knowledge through a dark age. Without writing, without cities, without institutions, without any guarantee that organized society would persist long enough to maintain records or train new generations. This is where the ancient world's mysterious inheritance systems stop looking like primitive superstition and start looking like sophisticated information technology. Astronomical alignments that encode observation data spanning millennia. Mathematical constants embedded in monuments. Mythological frameworks that preserve technical information through memorable narrative. Initiatory priesthoods that restrict and transmit knowledge through controlled chains of authority. All of these systems share a common characteristic. They're designed to preserve information across civilizational collapse. They don't require literacy. They don't require institutions. They require only human memory, oral transmission, and, in some cases, durable monuments that outlast the cultures that built them. What we've dismissed as primitive religion might actually be advanced information preservation, emergency protocols designed by people who had watched their world end and were determined that the next civilization wouldn't lose everything they had lost. The evidence for this interpretation appears in the monuments themselves, particularly in their astronomical alignments, because astronomy is a perfect information storage medium. The stars move in predictable cycles. If you encode information in astronomical positions, anyone with sufficient observational capability can decode it, even thousands of years later, even if they don't speak your language, even if they don't understand your culture. You simply build something permanent, oriented to celestial positions, and the information persists, waiting to be read. Earth's axial precession is a 26,000-year cycle caused by the slow wobble of the planet's rotation axis. From Earth's perspective, this wobble causes the stars to appear to drift slowly through the zodiac constellations, completing one full circuit every 26,000 years. The effect is subtle, about 1 degree of apparent shift every 72 years. Detecting it requires centuries of continuous astronomical observation. According to standard historical timelines, precession was discovered by Greek astronomer Hipparchus around 127 BC. He compared his observations to earlier Babylonian records and detected the shift. This discovery supposedly represents humanity's first awareness of axial precession. But here's the problem. Evidence of precession knowledge appears in monuments that predate Hipparchus by thousands of years. Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9600 BC, includes Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, the so-called vulture stone. The pillar is covered with carved animal symbols. In 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh conducted archaeoastronomical analysis of these symbols and proposed an interpretation. The carvings represent constellation positions as they appeared around 10,150 BC. The analysis identified specific animals as constellation markers. The vulture corresponds to the constellation we now call Cygnus, or the Northern Cross. The scorpion matches Scorpius. The positioning of these symbols on the pillar, according to the researchers, maps celestial positions from roughly 11,000 BC, coinciding with the proposed Younger Dryas impact event. If this interpretation is accurate, the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed astronomical knowledge and encoded a specific historical date, the date of a catastrophic event, in stone. They weren't recording their present, they were recording their past, memorializing the event that destroyed what came before. This requires precession knowledge. To accurately depict constellation positions from a specific historical date requires understanding that stellar positions change over millennia. It requires long-term astronomical observation, record-keeping, and transmission of knowledge across generations. The Giza pyramids present an even more controversial example. The three main pyramids align to Orion's belt. This much is undisputed. But the correlation isn't to Orion's position when the pyramids were built around 2500 BC. According to research by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, the pyramids align to Orion's position as it appeared around 10,500 BC. This observation forms the core of the Orion correlation theory. The argument is that the ancient Egyptians encoded a much older date in the monument's design. Why? To preserve memory of an earlier epoch, to memorialize the Zep Tepi, the first time that Egyptian texts repeatedly reference as the origin of their civilization. The mainstream response is predictable: coincidence. cherry-picked data, confirmation bias. The counter-argument notes that Orion moves through a precessional cycle, and its position in 10,500 BC would have been significantly different from its position in 2,500 BC. For the alignment to match 10,500 BC rather than the construction date would require deliberate calculation and intention. You don't accidentally align monuments to constellation positions from 8,000 years before you built them. Angkor Wat in Cambodia presents a similar pattern. The temple complex, constructed in the early 12th century AD, contains astronomical alignments that researchers have argued correspond to the constellation Draco's position not from the 12th century, but from approximately 10,500 BC. The same date cluster that appears at Giza and Göbekli Tepe. The pattern is either remarkable coincidence, multiple ancient sites on different continents independently aligning to the same archaic stellar positions, or it's evidence of inherited astronomical knowledge, knowledge of precession, knowledge of historical celestial positions, knowledge that was preserved and encoded deliberately in monuments across cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. The orthodox explanation requires you to believe that civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years independently decided to encode the same archaic date in their most important monuments by accident. The alternative explanation is simpler. These monuments encode inherited knowledge. They're preserving information from an earlier era when astronomical observation had been conducted long enough to detect and calculate precession, which means somewhere, somehow, continuous astronomical observation was being conducted before 10,000 BC. Long enough to map stellar positions, long enough to detect precession, long enough to understand the information was worth preserving. If astronomical alignments preserve observational data, mathematical constants preserve technical knowledge, and the ancient world's most important monuments are full of mathematical precision that exceeds what contemporary technology should have allowed. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes multiple mathematical relationships. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is 2p, exactly twice pi. This relationship appears whether you measure in ancient Egyptian cubits or modern meters. Coincidence? The pyramid's dimensions also approximate the ratio of Earth's radius to its circumference when scaled appropriately. The slope angle of 51.84 degrees produces specific geometric relationships between the height, base, and slant faces that incorporate both pi and phi, the golden ratio. Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, 3.141529. Phi is the golden ratio found throughout nature, 1.618. Both are irrational numbers that cannot be expressed as simple fractions. Officially, pi was calculated to precision by Greek mathematicians around 250 BC. Phi was formalized by Euclid around 300 BC. Yet both appear encoded in the Giza Pyramid, built around 2500 BC, 700 years before they were officially discovered. The mainstream explanation: aesthetic preference. The builders chose dimensions that looked pleasing, and those dimensions happened to approximate mathematical constants. The pyramid's proportions naturally tend toward these ratios because they're aesthetically harmonious. But this explanation doesn't account for the precision. The pyramid isn't approximately pi. It's accurate to multiple decimal places. The builders would have needed to calculate specific dimensions to achieve these ratios. Calculate them without the benefit of decimal notation, trigonometric tables, or the mathematical framework that defines these constants, unless they inherited the knowledge, unless these ratios were already known, already understood as significant, and deliberately embedded in the structure. Why embed mathematical constants in architecture? Because buildings outlast books, papyrus burns, clay tablets shatter, oral tradition corrupts over generations, but stone monuments endure for millennia. If you want to preserve mathematical knowledge across civilizational collapse, you don't write it down. You build it. You encode pi in the pyramid's proportions. You embed phi in the temple's dimensions. You create structures where the information persists in the physical form, accessible to anyone with sufficient mathematical knowledge to measure and calculate, regardless of what language they speak or what culture they belong to. The Parthenon in Athens, built in the 5th century BC, incorporates phi throughout its facade. The ratio of height to width, the spacing of columns, the proportions of decorative elements, all approximate the golden ratio. Roman architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, documented these proportions and claimed they derived from ancient principles of sacred geometry. The pattern appears globally. Mayan temples encode mathematical relationships. Angkor Wat's dimensions contain multiple geometric constants. Chinese palaces incorporate numerical symbolism. Medieval cathedrals embed mathematical ratios in their architecture. But the oldest examples, Giza, Göbekli Tepe, the megalithic sites, show the most sophisticated mathematical encoding, as if the knowledge was clearest at the beginning and slowly degraded over time, as if later civilizations were working from increasingly corrupted copies of an original template they no longer fully understood, which is exactly what you'd expect if the knowledge was inherited from an earlier era and gradually lost. If monuments preserve information in physical form, mystery schools preserve it through institutional control. And the ancient world was full of these systems, initiatory organizations that restricted access to knowledge, transmitted it orally through trusted chains, and often encoded it in ritual and myth. Egypt's priestly class operated this way. The priesthood at Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes maintained secrets of the gods, technical and astronomical knowledge that was restricted to initiated priests. Plato, in the Timaeus dialogue, describes Solon visiting Egyptian priests who possessed records older than memory, including accounts of civilizations that predated Egypt itself. The priests didn't openly publish their knowledge. They didn't create public archives. They maintained oral traditions, restricted texts, and initiatory hierarchies, where information was revealed gradually as students proved trustworthy. This system ensured knowledge survival even if writing systems failed or libraries burned. As long as the priesthood maintained its chain of transmission, the knowledge persisted. Greece developed similar systems. The Eleusinian Mysteries, initiatory rites that persisted for nearly 2,000 years, promised revelation of sacred knowledge to those who completed the rituals. What knowledge? We don't know. The initiates maintained secrecy so effectively that the mystery's content died with the last practitioners, but ancient sources describe the revelations as transformative, world-changing, providing understanding of cosmic principles and human destiny. The Pythagorean Brotherhood operated as a philosophical school, but functioned as a mystery cult. Pythagoras restricted mathematical knowledge to initiated members, who took oaths of secrecy. The famous Pythagorean theorem, A2 plus B2 has C2, wasn't published for public education. It was guarded knowledge, transmitted only to proven students. Why? Because Pythagoras claimed his mathematical insights derived from ancient sources, from Egyptian priests who taught him during his travels, from older wisdom traditions that predated Greek civilization. India preserved knowledge through similar systems. The Vedic schools transmitted sacred texts orally for millennia. The Rig Veda, composed around 1500 BC but claiming older origins, was memorized word-perfect by successive generations of Brahmin priests. No written copies existed for centuries. The entire corpus of knowledge, thousands of verses containing astronomical data, mathematical principles, philosophical concepts, and ritual procedures, lived only in human memory. This oral transmission wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated information security. Written texts can be destroyed. Libraries burn. But knowledge encoded in human memory, transmitted through controlled lineages, survives wars, natural disasters, and civilizational collapse. As long as the transmission chain doesn't break, the information persists. Mesopotamian temple priesthoods controlled astronomical knowledge, maintained mathematical tables, and regulated calendars. They didn't publish their data. They restricted it to initiated temple scribes who underwent years of training. The astronomical observations recorded on clay tablets represent only a fraction of the knowledge they possessed. The rest remained oral, transmitted through apprenticeship. The pattern repeats across cultures. Knowledge restricted to initiated elite, transmitted orally or through controlled texts, often encoded in myth and ritual, that makes information memorable while obscuring technical content from uninitiated observers. Orthodox historians interpret this as religious superstition and social control, priests restricting knowledge to maintain power, mystery cults creating artificial exclusivity to attract followers, oral transmission representing primitive, pre-literate society rather than sophisticated information technology. But consider the alternative interpretation. These aren't primitive systems. They're post-collapse protocols. If you've survived civilizational catastrophe and retained fragments of advanced knowledge, you would naturally 1. Restrict access to prevent dilution and corruption. 2. Encode information in memorable forms like myth and ritual. 3. Transmit through trusted networks rather than public dissemination. 4. Prioritize preservation over accessibility. Mystery schools aren't primitive religion. They're information security systems designed for dark ages. Systems that ensure knowledge survives when institutions collapse and writing systems fail. From Plato to Pythagoras to medieval alchemists, Western tradition repeatedly claims that true knowledge comes from the ancients. This claim appears so consistently across 2,000 years of scholarship that it has a name: Prisca Theologia, ancient theology. The idea that all religions and philosophical systems derive from a single ancient source, a primordial wisdom tradition that predates known civilizations. Renaissance scholars Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno were obsessed with recovering this ancient knowledge. They studied Hermetic texts attributed to Thoth Hermes, supposedly containing Egyptian wisdom from before the pyramids. They analyzed Platonic dialogues claiming transmission from Egyptian priests. They sought mathematical and astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments and texts. Mainstream treatment dismisses this as appeals to antiquity for authority. Scholars claiming their ideas derive from ancient sources to make them sound more legitimate. A rhetorical strategy rather than historical claim. But what if it's simpler? What if ancient scholars actually were accessing older knowledge repositories, surviving manuscripts, oral traditions, encoded monuments that genuinely predated their civilizations? What if the appeal to ancient wisdom wasn't rhetorical strategy but accurate description? Egyptian priests explicitly told Solon that their records predated Greek civilization. Hindu texts explicitly claim derivation from earlier yugas. Buddhist traditions speak of lost teachings from previous world ages. Medieval scholars explicitly stated they were recovering ancient knowledge, not inventing new systems. The ancient wisdom tradition either represents 3,000 years of consistent lying. Scholars across different cultures independently fabricating the same false claim. Or it's an accurate claim we've misunderstood. Perhaps ancient scholars actually did possess access to older knowledge. Perhaps the systems they preserved genuinely derived from earlier sources. Perhaps their insistence on antiquity reflects historical reality rather than rhetorical convenience. The pattern is advanced knowledge appearing in early known civilizations without visible development period, coupled with explicit claims by those civilizations that the knowledge was inherited, not invented. Astronomical knowledge without centuries of observation. Mathematical constants without theoretical framework, engineering precision without experimental phase, mystery schools preserving secrets they claim predate their cultures, texts referencing earlier sources and earlier ages. This isn't proof of lost civilization, but it's exactly what you'd expect to find if one existed. Knowledge systems that seem inherited rather than invented, cultural memory insisting on antiquity, institutional structures designed for preservation rather than innovation, monuments encoding information that survives when everything else collapses. The inheritance systems, astronomical alignments, mathematical encoding, mystery schools, ancient wisdom claims, form a coherent pattern. They're all mechanisms for preserving information across civilizational collapse. They all suggest that early, post-Ice Age civilizations understood themselves not as inventors, but as inheritors, as rebuilders working from fragmented memory of what came before. Which brings us to the final question. If all this evidence, buried cities, impossible stones, drowned structures, flood myths, geological catastrophe, inheritance systems, points toward a pre-Ice Age civilization that was destroyed and partially rebuilt, what do the oldest written texts actually say about their origins? Because when you read the ancient texts not as mythology but as attempted history, they tell a remarkably consistent story. A story about what came before, a story about how it ended, and a story about how the world we know emerged from the ruins of what was lost. The oldest written texts don't describe the invention of knowledge. They describe the preservation of it. From Sumerian king lists claiming pre-flood dynasties lasting thousands of years, to Egyptian texts referencing the first time, to Plato's detailed account of Atlantis, the ancient written record consistently points backward to something older. These aren't origin stories in the way we typically understand them. They're inheritance stories, accounts of how knowledge, culture, and civilization came from an earlier epoch, and when you read them not as mythology but as attempted history, a pattern emerges that archaeology keeps validating. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on clay tablets around 2100 BC, presents one of history's most puzzling documents. It lists the kings of Sumer in chronological order, starting with the earliest rulers and proceeding forward to the historical period. The list is accurate for the later kings. We can verify them archaeologically. Their reign lengths are plausible. The sequence matches other records. But the first section describes 8 kings who ruled before the flood swept over. Their reign lengths are impossible. Alulim of Eridu ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. The numbers continue in similar magnitudes. Total pre-flood kingship, 241,200 years. The mainstream interpretation, pure mythology. Impossibly long reigns prove these kings never existed. The scribes were creating mythological prehistory to give their civilization ancient pedigree. But here's the anomaly. Why would scribes who accurately record recent history suddenly become fantastical about earlier history? The post-flood section is historically reliable. The pre-flood section uses the same documentary style, the same formulaic structure, the same matter-of-fact tone. The only difference is the numbers. Alternative reading. The numbers are corrupted or misunderstood, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individual reigns, or using a different temporal counting system. But the structure preserves real memory. There were organized kingdoms before the flood. Sumerian culture understood itself as post-catastrophe, not original. The civilization they built was a rebuild, not a beginning. The king list isn't accurate chronology, but it's consistent cultural memory that civilization existed before Sumer, that something was lost, that what they built emerged from what came before. Egyptian tradition operates from the same premise. Zep-Tepi, the first time, appears repeatedly in Egyptian texts as the golden age when gods walked the earth and founded civilization. This wasn't vague mythological past. It was a specific historical epoch that Egyptians understood as the source of their knowledge. The Edfu temple texts, inscribed during the Ptolemaic period but claiming derivation from much older sources, describe the builder gods who created sacred mounds after primordial waters receded. These divine beings established the fundamental structures of Egyptian civilization: temples, measurement systems, astronomical knowledge, architectural principles. The narrative structure is revealing: destruction by water, then rebuilding by survivors who possessed superior knowledge. The texts describe how these builder gods established civilization on the newly exposed land, creating centers of learning and worship that became the foundation of later Egyptian culture. The Turin king list, though fragmentary, lists pre-dynastic rulers including spirits and followers of Horus before the first pharaohs. These aren't presented as mythological beings, but as historical rulers from an earlier age. The list treats them with the same documentary style used for verified historical pharaohs. Why would Egyptians consistently point to an earlier age as the source of their knowledge if they were the inventors? Most cultures claim to be first, to be original, to be the source of innovation. Egypt claims to be a successor, an inheritor, a rebuilder of what came before. This self-conception as inheritors rather than inventors matches the archaeological pattern perfectly. Sophisticated culture appearing without visible development period. Advanced astronomical knowledge without evidence of the centuries of observation required to acquire it. Architectural precision that seems inherited rather than invented. Mathematical constants embedded in monuments built before those constants were officially discovered. Egyptian culture's explicit claim, "We inherited this from the first time," explains these anomalies better than theories of independent invention. Plato's Atlantis account deserves closer examination precisely because it's been so thoroughly dismissed. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues present a story that Plato frames as history multiple times. Solon, visiting Egypt around 600 BC, hears from priests at Sais about a civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, approximately 9,600 BC. The priests tell him that Greeks are like children, with no knowledge of antiquity. Egypt alone preserves records of the deep past, including accounts of civilizations that rose and fell before anything Greeks remember. They describe Atlantis, an advanced island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, possessing superior technology, architecture, and naval power. This civilization conquered parts of the Mediterranean, but was eventually defeated. Shortly after, both Atlantis and the victorious Athenian army were destroyed by earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night, Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The orthodox position, philosophical allegory. Plato invented Atlantis as a thought experiment, a cautionary tale about hubris and imperial overreach. The story serves his philosophical agenda too perfectly to be historical, but consider the details. The date, 9,600 BC. This aligns precisely with the end of the Younger Dryas, the period of maximum climatic instability, the window when Göbekli Tepe was constructed, the era when meltwater pulses would have inundated coastal settlements. If Plato was inventing a date, why choose one that aligns so precisely with actual geological catastrophe? The description, advanced coastal civilization with sophisticated architecture, urban planning, and naval power. Exactly what would develop on stable Ice Age coastlines with centuries of accumulated development. Exactly what would be destroyed when sea levels rose and tectonic activity triggered collapse. The destruction mechanism, earthquake and sinking. The Mediterranean is tectonically active. Coastal subsidence combined with rapid sea level rise would create exactly this appearance. An island civilization vanishing beneath rising waters within a generation. Plato's account probably doesn't describe a literal island civilization named Atlantis with the exact features he details, but the template, advanced coastal civilization destroyed by water around 9,600 BC, matches every pattern we've been tracing. The buried cities, the drowned structures, the flood myths, the geological catastrophe, the inheritance systems, the simplest explanation. Plato recorded a garbled memory of real events. Egyptian priests preserved fragmentary accounts of Ice Age, coastal civilizations destroyed during the Holocene transition. Solon heard these accounts. The story was transmitted through Plato's family. Plato recorded it, adding interpretations and possibly conflating multiple sources, but working from a historical core. Atlantis, as described, probably doesn't exist. But what it represents, sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilization destroyed by catastrophe, matches the evidence. We've moved through 7 categories of evidence. Buried cities beneath accepted first civilizations. Megalithic precision predating available technology. Drowned structures on Ice Age coastlines. Global flood narratives clustering around 10,000 BC. Geological catastrophe in the same period. Inheritance systems preserving astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Ancient texts claiming derivation from earlier sources. Each category has mainstream explanations. Buried cities are local flooding. Megalithic precision is underestimated ancient capability. Drowned structures are natural formations or insufficient evidence. Flood myths are universal archetypes. Inheritance systems are primitive religion. Ancient texts are appeals to antiquity for authority. Each explanation, examined individually, is defensible, but together they form a pattern that doesn't fit the standard timeline. The standard model: civilization begins around 6000 BC in Mesopotamia, spreads outward, develops gradually through predictable stages. Agriculture enables settlement. Settlement enables specialization. Specialization enables complexity. Writing emerges. Cities form. Technology advances linearly. Each civilization independently invents similar solutions to similar problems. The alternative model suggested by this evidence: organized, sophisticated culture existed during the late Ice Age on now submerged coastlines. This culture achieved substantial development: monumental architecture, astronomical knowledge, mathematical understanding, social complexity. Between 13,000 BC and 8,000 BC, this civilization was destroyed by cascading catastrophes, possible cosmic impact triggering the Younger Dryas, followed by rapid climate instability, megafauna extinctions, ice sheet collapse, and catastrophic sea level rise. Survivors scattered inland. Coastal cities were drowned. Knowledge was fragmented. The survivors preserved what they could through oral tradition, monumental architecture, and restricted initiatory systems. Known ancient civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, Indus Valley, China, represent restarts. Rebuilding efforts by survivors or their descendants. Not independent invention, but recovery of inherited knowledge. This isn't proof. It's a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis that better fits the pattern, which means everything we call the beginning of history might actually be Chapter 2. The restart after catastrophe. The rebuilding after collapse. The effort to recover what was lost when the Ice Age ended and the waters rose. If this hypothesis is accurate, the implications are profound. We're not the first technological civilization. We're the second, or the third, or the 10th. The knowledge systems we use, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, might not be recent inventions, but recovered memories. Systems that were known, lost, and painstakingly rebuilt from fragments. The mystery of why complex ideas appear fully formed in early civilizations isn't mysterious. It's inheritance. The puzzle of how pre-agricultural peoples built Göbekli Tepe isn't a puzzle. They weren't pre-agricultural. They were post-catastrophe survivors who retained engineering knowledge. The question of why ancient texts claim ancient sources isn't a question. They actually did derive from older traditions. But here's the deeper, more unsettling realization. If civilization collapsed before, it can collapse again. And when it does, survivors will face the same challenges we've been examining: preserving knowledge without infrastructure, rebuilding without resources, maintaining memory across dark ages, preventing the complete loss of accumulated understanding. The systems we've examined: encoding knowledge in monuments, restricting information to initiated priesthoods, preserving stories in myth. These aren't primitive superstitions. They're survival protocols, emergency procedures designed by people who understood that civilization is fragile, that catastrophe is possible, that knowledge must be preserved in forms that transcend individual lifespans and institutional collapse. Which raises a final question. If we faced sudden collapse tomorrow, what would we encode? What would survive? Would future civilizations 10,000 years from now argue about whether we existed, dismissing our monuments as natural formations and our stories as myths? The pattern suggests we're not at the origin of civilization. We're somewhere in the middle of a cycle, and the ground beneath us holds the evidence of what came before. The archaeological record keeps revealing older sophistication. Marine surveys keep detecting underwater structures. Geological studies keep confirming catastrophic climate events. Ancient texts keep insisting on earlier sources. The oldest empire in human history wasn't lost. It's beneath us, buried under sediment, drowned under oceans, encrypted in monuments, preserved in myths. The archaeological record, the geological record, the textual record, the architectural record, they all point to the same conclusion. What we call the beginning of history is a restart, not an origin. This isn't fringe speculation anymore. It's a pattern documented across multiple disciplines that academia has chosen to treat as separate anomalies rather than connected evidence. The timeline you learned is incomplete. The story you were told is missing chapters. And the world's oldest empire is still here, waiting beneath every excavation that dares to dig deeper, beneath every coastline we haven't yet explored, encoded in every monument we've stopped truly examining, preserved in every myth we've dismissed as fantasy. You've been living above history. Now you know what lies below. The evidence doesn't demand belief. It demands investigation. It demands that we stop dismissing anomalies and start recognizing patterns. It demands that we question timelines that don't accommodate the data. It demands that we read ancient texts as possible history rather than definite mythology. Because if the pattern is real, if sophisticated civilization existed before known history and was destroyed by catastrophe, then we're not just discovering the past. We're recovering warnings. The flood myths aren't just stories about what happened. They're instructions about what could happen again. The inheritance systems aren't just primitive religion. They're protocols for surviving collapse and preserving knowledge across dark ages. Protocols we might need again. The world changed once before, rapidly, catastrophically. Civilization-ending change compressed into a few thousand years. The survivors encoded their experience in every way they could. In monuments that would outlast languages. In myths that would survive institutional collapse. In mystery traditions that would preserve knowledge when libraries burned. They left us a message, not in words, because languages change and texts decay. In stone, in story, in systems designed to be read by anyone with sufficient wisdom to recognize them. The message is simple. This happened before. It can happen again. Preserve what matters. Encode it in durable forms. Build monuments that outlast empires. Create systems that survive catastrophe. Remember that civilization is newer than we think, more fragile than we believe. And always, always one disaster away from needing to restart from memory. Sweet dreams.